Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 399 part 2. You know what the drill is, so we're just going to get straight on with answering questions. Library of Context asks, "It would have been merciful had it killed me," Admiral Kimmel saying after being harmlessly struck by shrapnel at Pearl Harbour. If Kimmel had been killed during the attack on Pearl Harbour, how does this impact his reputation after the battle? Would he still be a scapegoat? I think it very much depends on the manner of his death. If he's just in his office and, I don't know, when Arizona blows up, a big chunk of it comes sailing through and just crushes the office with him inside it, so some kind of incidental death to the overall attack, then he probably actually becomes even more of a scapegoat because, well, he's not alive to defend himself, and without having died in any kind of particularly glorious death, it's very easy to lump most of the criticism on him because he's not there to respond to it. Whereas, if he dies in some kind of action that would be read by the public as heroic, perhaps jumping in his staff car and heading to the base to try and help out and get strafed by a Zero, or maybe he reaches the base and decides to man an anti-aircraft gun or something because, well, at that point, what else can he do, and gets taken out in that manner, well, then he dies defending his command as a hero, and whatever deficiencies there may have been in the run-up, it's very difficult, at least in the public eye, and certainly even perhaps in a lot of the rank and file of the Navy's eyes, to criticize someone who goes down fighting, almost regardless of anything that may or may not have occurred in the run-up to that attack. So, yeah, he might end up as a scapegoat even more than he did. He might not be a scapegoat at all. I think it purely depends on the manner of his death. Fitch's Fifth Fleet Fish Fleecer, fiercely fishing for fleeting fish for 4 fish fritter flavour favours, asks, "What was the longest time that there was combat aboard a single vessel in the manner of a boarding action or mutiny?" In the main time period the channel covers, the single longest practically continuous fight is probably back to the last stand of HMS Revenge, because that took about 15 hours between action being opened and the ship finally surrendering, and a lot of that involved multiple boarding attempts from multiple Spanish ships. Obviously there'll be small lulls in between, but you can effectively treat it as a continuous action. In terms of the longest intermittent combat, you're probably looking at the 4 days battle, which was in one of the Anglo-Dutch wars. Well, and the name kind of gives the clue away. It was 4 days of on-again, off-again, but mostly on-again continuous combat between various Dutch and English ships, with a good chunk of that being occupied with some ships being boarded and, in some cases, counter-boarded or having friends come along to assist them. Camino John asks, "I recall watching a Modern Marvels type video where the US Navy's explosive experts were required to detonate numerous Tomahawk and Harpoon missile warheads since the explosives had aged out in terms of being part of the active weapon system safely. My question is, how did navies in the black powder age cycle through their stocks? Did they just expend it all for practice drills, or did it get cycled out and sold for civilian uses, while new stocks were issued to outbound vessels and replenishing shore-based magazines? It seems to me that you would need a large cache of black powder ready to go in case an armed conflict breaks out, especially having it staged to various facilities across the globe. However, it seems that this amount would exceed any training requirements." Well, weirdly enough, as long as you store it in a cool, dry environment, black powder is actually incredibly chemically stable. So you wouldn't necessarily have significant stocks aging out. Now, of course, if you keep it in a warm, damp environment with constant temperature fluctuations, then yeah, it will degrade. However, if you go to something like, say, the Museum of Naval Firepower in Portsmouth, which is part of the National Museum of the Royal Navy, one of the things you can visit is the Grand Magazine, where they stored most of the black powder stocks for the Royal Navy back in the Age of Sail in Portsmouth. And it's a massive brick structure half sunken into the ground, which is essentially environmentally controlled, 17th, 18th century style. And so you could store ridiculous amounts of black powder there, pretty much, as I say, as long as you wanted to. Now, you did obviously have to check to make sure there hadn't been little pockets of moisture building up and so forth. But as long as you did that, you were fine. And, of course, aboard ships, because, of course, when black powder degrades, not only does it become not particularly useful, but can also become even more dangerous, the ship's magazines are kept dry, well below the waterline, so mostly temperature controlled in copper-lined areas. So, again, generally speaking, as long as the ship isn't subjected to extremes of weather and is kept reasonably well maintained, its powder also will stay pretty much in good condition. If there are small amounts that start to degrade, then if you catch it beginning to degrade, you can essentially just expend it for training drills or something like that. But if it does fully degrade, well, I'm given to understand there are ways of restoring it. It's not particularly safe to do so. So at that point, yeah, you would have to dispose of it. But the cycle of old black powder, if you like, and being replaced with new is essentially a very minimal cycle compared to modern, more complex explosives, which, as you say, will age out even if you keep them in optimal storage conditions. Nietwitz of Gdansk asks, I know the answer would be pretty long, so I divided my question into two parts. The second part this month is, finishing on with the subject of the unfortunate Admiral Arbuthnot, what was the Admiralty's response to this matter after the Battle of Jutland? Most sources describe the investigation and conclusions following the loss of the battle cruisers, but the loss of 3 armoured cruisers and over 1,600 sailors was also a great loss. Was the loss of the battle cruisers such a shock that no one bothered about the lost armoured cruisers? Or what were the conclusions and recommendations? Did Jellicoe take ships of this class on subsequent raids? So, in regards to the fate of armoured cruisers in the Grand Fleet, they do seem to have been hived off from the Grand Fleet pretty quickly. Some of them, a core of the most modern ones, were retained. So, for example, later on in the year, when the High Seas Fleet came out and the Grand Fleet sailed in a failed attempt to intercept them, there were still some of the armoured cruisers along for the ride, in part because although obviously 1st Cruiser Squadron suffered such heavy losses, they were still seen as fairly valuable in taking out the German fleet screen units, because the Germans didn't have any armoured cruisers in their fleet screens. So if the British battle cruisers could at least stalemate the German ones, then the Germans would only have small cruisers, basically protected cruisers and early light cruisers, along with destroyers, and for that role, the armoured cruisers were perfectly viable. Just don't go charging into the German battle line. But it does seem that there was a general feeling of we probably should move these guys onward sooner rather than later. And by 1917, pretty much all armoured cruisers still in British service had been assigned to patrols. Someone still notionally assigned to the Grand Fleet, but they were mostly off, patrolling the northern blockade, patrolling up to Norway and so forth, things like this. As regards the loss of the armoured cruisers, you've got to remember that did take place across kind of 2-3 separate events. So Black Prince was destroyed during the night after having just apparently gotten a bit lost. Defence, of course, blew up with Admiral Arbuthnot on board in the immediate aftermath of his charge on Wiesbaden, but Warrior stuck around for quite a while before eventually succumbing. But overall, most people, in terms of the reports and everything, seemed somewhat confused about what Arbuthnot was actually trying to do, to the extent that some actually even suggested that perhaps defence had taken a hit to the bridge while he was trying to manoeuvre to his place adjacent to the battle line, and without any other orders, the ship had just continued on the course it had been at that point, which obviously then led it to destruction. However, most other people thought that Arbuthnot, being a very aggressive officer, had probably just wanted to charge down and destroy Wiesbaden. And indeed, one of his friends actually said after the fact that Arbuthnot knew where he was supposed to be when the battle line deployed, but of course how he got there would vary depending on which direction the battle line went, and he had a choice of either sailing on the unengaged side of the battle line or down the engaged side of the battle line to get to the position he was supposed to be. And, okay, sane and sensible officers might go, well, I'll just go around the unengaged side then, but he was determined to go around the engaged side. So, he was probably just being a bit too aggressive for his own good, was the conclusion of most people. But, of course, with essentially 0 survivors from defence, it was very difficult to make any further conclusion than that. Rodney McCoy asks, after watching one of your rival podcasts about the sinking of Repulse and Prince of Wales, there was a question that was left unanswered. Could 2 1944 South Dakota battleships and 4 1944 Fletcher-class destroyers beat off the attack that sunk Prince of Wales and Repulse? Well, given that, barring the rather unlucky strike to the stern of Prince of Wales and the somewhat unintentional pincer attack that eventually took out Repulse, without those 2 bits of luck for the Japanese, the British formation aforesaid would have survived. Statistically speaking, yes, of course, 2 1944 Sodaks with obviously all their radar and AA defences and 4 1944 Fletchers with their radar and air defences would almost certainly survive the attack by the Japanese bombers. However, I would put a bit of a qualifier on that. Firstly, the main way I think they would survive ideally would be to have the Fletchers forming a picket screen against the bombers, because that would disrupt and break up the incoming attacks and obviously potentially shoot down some of the bombers. And then if you have a scattered, broken up attack facing the firepower of a 1944 Sodaks anti-aircraft battery, then everything is going to go quite badly for the Japanese. So yeah, that's fairly survivable, especially considering that the Japanese don't have huge numbers or huge amounts of fuel left. They basically kind of have one and done attack runs. Well, with torpedo bombers, you tend to only have one and done attack runs, but it's more a case of you can't stick around for a long time seeking an advantageous position, because very soon you will be out of fuel. But there are situations where things still could go wrong, because obviously the bombers can, and as they did historically, still circle around for an attack. So, for example, if the US force sees the Japanese bombers coming and they put all the Fletchers out in a screen to one side of the battleships to receive the incoming attack, but the Japanese see that formation and go around it so that they can attack the unprotected side of the South Dakotas, then they quote-unquote only have to deal with the majority of the South Dakota's anti-aircraft battery, which will let them get a little bit closer with fewer casualties than if they were going over the Fletcher skirmish line. So from that perspective, it might be better to have one Fletcher on either beam and one Fletcher fore and aft, so at least some of the destroyers manage to engage an incoming airstrike. But of course, that means less effective engagement, because there's only one, maybe 2 that will be in range. But if you do get a situation where the South Dakotas are being attacked directly because the Fletchers are caught on the wrong side of the formation, then yeah, the G4M units and so forth are going to get ripped apart, but there's still a chance that one or more of them might drop a lucky torpedo, and as well as potentially obviously replicating what happened to Prince of Wales, there is also the other issue of, as we know, there were a couple of weaknesses in US fast battleship torpedo defense systems, which could result in one lucky hit causing catastrophic flooding. Now, of course, that relies on the luck of, well, enough bombers surviving to launch a meaningful torpedo strike, and that torpedo strike not being evaded, and that torpedo strike being on target, and then of the torpedoes that strike, one or more of them hitting one of those key areas. So it is statistically very unlikely to happen, but it's not completely ignorable. And obviously, if that does happen, then potentially one of the ships could be crippled or lost. I don't think they'd take out both, though. That realistically, as in, has a statistically significant chance of happening. There is a potential to lose one of the Sodaks in a very outlying situation. Maybe losing one or more Fletchers is perhaps even more possible. Still, obviously, not very likely. Still on the sub 50% side. Very much less than 50% chance. The majority chance is the US formation survives. Maybe with a bit of damage here or there. But bad luck happens to everyone, as indeed it did happen aforesaid. His Hibernian Majesty Rigel, the 16th Dominator 600 billion subjects, progenitor of many a nobody's puppet, asks, who did a better job at converting a steam frigate, the Union with Roanoke or the Confederacy with Merrimack? Also, if Roanoke was completed with a unitary armament, would it be significant enough to warrant a different definition of unitary armament when dreadnoughts arrive on the scene? I think it's a little bit of a split decision. In terms of generating the most powerful ironclad, the Union clearly did a better job with the Roanoke. It carried heavier guns, it carried turrets, so it could bring them to bear on lots of different bearings, whereas obviously the Merrimack-Virginia was limited to what side you could point its broadside at, and a couple of chase guns, and so forth. However, in terms of actually useful vessel, as in, actually did something for its side, I think the Confederacy actually edges things out because, well, they actually got Virginia into service at a point where it was somewhat useful, and obviously that forced the generation of a whole bunch of ironclads by the Union. The Virginia also then went out and sank a few targets before being stalemated by Monitor, and ultimately, while Virginia was not able to overcome Monitor, neither was she overcome by Monitor, so she did her job. There weren't any major flaws with the Virginia. I mean, sure, the ramming didn't necessarily go quite as well as intended, but for an experimental warship, she did most of what you could expect her to do. Whereas with the poor old Roanoke, not only did it take well over a year to actually get her in service, which, by the time she enters service, a lot of the need for her specifically has dried up, but also she does fail in a number of her objectives, because one of the objectives is to make a more seaworthy ironclad. She rolls so much they have to end up shoring up the guns to make sure they don't just fall off. So, yeah, seaworthy she ain't. And also, when she actually test fires her guns the first time, a bunch of them just fall off their mountings, which isn't brilliant, which Virginia certainly didn't do. So as a technical exercise, I think Virginia-Merrimack went from concept to execution far faster and in a far more useful fashion than Roanoke, which took, in American Civil War terms, forever and a day and then didn't work properly. Objectively, on paper, if she did work properly, yes, she was the more powerful vessel, but a theoretically powerful vessel after you've had to patch up and retrofit it several times a couple of years after you actually needed it, I would argue is not necessarily as successful as a somewhat slapdash, technically inferior job, but one that is actually there at the time that you require it. As far as if she'd been fitted with a unitary armament, i.e. all 11-inch or all 15-inch Dahlgrens or all 150-pounder Parrots or whatever, I don't think this would manifestly have affected all that much. But in terms of, would we need a different definition for dreadnought? Because ultimately, whatever her ambitions, Roanoke is a coastal defense ship and a bit of a conversion job at that. And by dint of having 6 guns of the same caliber, well, a lot of central battery ironclads did that and more, she would have some distinction of being the first ship with more than 2 turrets with the same caliber of guns. But I think because she'd be such a one-off and a bit of a weird-looking vessel with no real follow-ups, I don't think it would impact on the impact of dreadnought really all that much. Mike Hall asks, years ago I looked at the history of Trafalgar and concluded that, once the dust had settled after the gale, the sortie from Cardiff, the shipwrecks and Strauchan's battle at Cape Portugal, all that remained of the combined fleet, at least for ships of the line, was 5 French and 5 Spanish ships in Cadiz. However, I recently read an article that claimed that 11 ships of the line survived, and Wikipedia, for what that's worth, currently says 9. So what is the correct number, and what happened to them after the Spanish capture of Rosili's squadron following the Dos de Mayo uprising in 1808? I think that the French ships were then taken into Spanish service, so they might have fought in the Peninsular War or against the rebellious South American colonies, but did they achieve anything notable? I come to the same conclusion as you, that overall there were 5 French and 5 Spanish. I mean, theoretically, I can see where someone might be coming from with 9, because 9 would be the number that actually survived, and then the 10th being the recapture of Santa Ana. So for those of you following along at home, the surviving French ships would be the Eros, Neptune, Pluton, Algeciras, and Argonaut, or Argonote. The Spanish would be San Leonardo, San Justo, Montanes, Príncipe de Asturias, and as just mentioned, the Santa Ana, which was recaptured. And the 5 French ships, along with the frigate Corneille, or Corneille, maybe, which I think, yeah, that's probably people mistaking that one for an 11th vessel. They were then all captured when the Spanish decided they'd had enough of being run by the French and switched sides. And as for their fates, Argonaute seems to have been converted into a prison hulk, while Algeciras, Pluton, Eros, and Neptune, although pretty much all being renamed to Spanish variants of their name or actually renamed for lost Spanish ships, went on to serve with the Spanish for the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, although they don't seem to have seen any further major action, mostly acting as transport vessels, either for supplies or for troops in various actions overseas, and then sort of just ending up as reserve vessels and winding down along with pretty much of the Spanish Empire in the aftermath. Will Sanders asks, while preparing for a whirlwind visit to HMS Victory, I read about her being rammed by HMS Neptune, who had broken her cables on the way to being scrapped. Is this the British version of the American run battleship aground in home waters trait? There seems to be a disturbing number of times this happens to your ships. Yeah, there are a fair number of British ships that, when confronted with a journey to the scrappers, seem to just go, no, I don't think so, and just make a bid for freedom. Albeit, I think I would say it's probably a factor of 2 major things. Firstly, the sheer number of British warships at that point, with enough of them built, that eventually most of them are going to go to scrap, and therefore, statistically, some of them are going to break their cables, and if you've got a lot of them, there's going to be a lot of broken cables compared to some other navies. And also, as I've mentioned relatively recently, you have this thing where most British warships being taken off to the scrappers are being taken off by private hands rather than the Navy themselves. And, well, private scrapyards tend to try and cut costs wherever possible and possibly don't necessarily always pay attention to the weather either. So, given that a large warship is a relatively infrequent thing to be towing, it is perhaps understandable that the various tugs and such perhaps lose them a little bit more often than you might otherwise think. Much in the same way as, an awful lot of American battleships at some point or another run aground in their home waters, which is quite amusing for most people, but is also, to a certain extent, explicable by the fact that a lot of American home waters are actually quite difficult to navigate. So one minor screw-up, and oh look, we're stuck on the mud. Prusi Antica asks, can you talk a little bit about the Victorian-era troop ships, i.e. the Euphrates class, the Tamar, the Orontes, etc.? Were there advantages or disadvantages in having purpose-built troop ships versus the later system of just using large ocean liners as troop ships? I think these ships were pretty useful in the classic period of the British Empire, because compared to regular commercial shipping, you could build them to house a specific unit, so like in this case a brigade, and that meant that you could have all the necessary accommodations for the whole unit in there, rather than with commercial ships where to try to fit a certain military unit in, it might involve either cramming a lot of people in very, very tightly or having a little bit of unused space and therefore being somewhat inefficient. Likewise, obviously, if you're designing the troop ship yourself, you can also design in all the appropriate cargo hatches and handling and storage for guns and equipment and ammunition and supplies and all the other things that a unit of troops might otherwise need. Whereas obviously, again, with a commercial ship, you're kind of having to make do with whatever you happen to have. Obviously, operating them doesn't disrupt commercial shipping, which helps. And in the classic era of the British Empire, they are actually definitely needed, because even in times of peace, there are regular rotations of troops to and from various parts of the empire. And unless you want to constantly be annoying the commercial shippers by saying, oh yeah, like every 6 months or every year or every 2 years, we're going to need to borrow one of your ships, by having your own small fleet of troop ships, you just do that as a regular part of their duty, which is a very handy and reliable way of doing things, because you also know what the capabilities of these ships are. The only real downsides to them are, one, of course, they exist, therefore you have to pay to maintain them, as opposed to with commercial shipping, where you just kind of go, okay, this is ours now on an as-needed basis, although there are obviously still costs involved there. There's also the fact that at any given time there aren't that many of them, so while they're perfectly good for moving around troops in peacetime and in times of minor crisis, and of course they can be useful if a conflict breaks out, when a conflict does break out, you are still going to need to requisition commercial shipping to operate alongside them. And of course you have the limitation of advancing technology, so this kind of vessel, which is designed for transporting line infantry units with late era muskets, early era rifles, and light field guns, for example, if they had survived into the 20th century, which they generally didn't, but if they had, or even if there had been a major war that the British were called upon that used different equipment, like, I don't know, the Boer Wars, and suddenly you need longer barrel, larger, heavier field artillery, or, again, if you'd gone into the 20th century, armoured cars and tanks and this kind of stuff, these ships are obviously not configured to carry or transport that kind of equipment. Whereas a mixed-use merchant vessel that has generic large cargo holds might actually be more useful in those circumstances. And then, of course, once you get to World War I and World War II, A, you're moving far, far, far more troops, and B, at that point, ocean liners have gotten to a size and scale where you can cram thousands upon thousands upon thousands of men into them. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, I've been enjoying the History Undone segments with you in them, but I was a bit surprised by the Jutland Special's criticism of Admiral Jellicoe. I found the comparisons to Admiral Nelson most confounding. There was a material benefit to Britain as a result of a decisive win at Trafalgar, and while a loss at Trafalgar wouldn't have been a good thing, it wouldn't necessarily spell the end of the Empire. Conversely, a Trafalgar-like win for Jellicoe would do relatively little to end World War I, and Britain might as well bow out of the war the next morning had he lost. I believe Jellicoe's caution prioritised the good of the Empire over vainglory, and as such, criticism of him in this respect is myopic. I would be interested in your thoughts. So this is one of the interesting things about doing something like History Undone, as compared to perhaps some of the interviews that I do on the channel, because when I do an interview on the channel, I've brought someone in who is a subject matter expert on their field, and they are obviously telling us about whatever it is that they are an expert in, and I'm asking questions. And some of them are more back and forth discussions, but generally speaking, it's a case of I'm asking questions so that they can tell you about the thing that they've been doing a huge amount of work on. Whereas when I'm on History Undone, opposite Admiral Chris Parry, obviously he is a historian and, as the title might suggest, former naval officer. I'm also a naval historian, so when we're telling you about, in the format of History Undone, what happened and then what might have happened if the circumstances were different, we're telling you the history of things, but we're also giving two different opinions on some of the commanders, some of the events, some of the factors that led up to that history of things. So we agree on what happened, but as to why it happened and how you should judge the people on who caused those things to happen, obviously, Admiral Parry and I do occasionally have differences of opinion over, people like Admiral Jellicoe or various other characters in naval history, at which point, obviously, within the format of something like History Undone, it's not our job to sit there having an argument between the two of us over which of us is correct. It's our job to present our arguments, and then the audience can conclude which of the two of us they think is more or less correct in our view on whether it be Jellicoe or Shear or Hipper or Beatty or any number of other people. Obviously, those are the people involved in Jutland specifically. And the other thing to remember is, of course, that when we're looking at the second part of the video, when we're looking at what could potentially have happened, obviously, Admiral Jellicoe in this particular circumstance made the decisions he made for good reasons. In the latter section, we're then looking at what different decisions he might have made. And of course, that would require a different motivation, a different set of circumstances, a different interpretation of the evidence, perhaps different evidence available to him, etc. At which point, obviously, comparisons will be made between what he did and what he could, at least in hindsight, have done, or may have done had, as we said, things been slightly different. So I would put that into the context of how the discussion was going on. Of course, as you've told from my own Jutland video series, I hold Admiral Jellicoe in fairly high regard. And yes, in theory, there were things he could have done that could have led to a more decisive British victory at Jutland. But given the circumstances he was in and the cards that he was dealt, it's fairly understandable why he did what he did. Scott Jennings asks, the question from last month's Patreon Drydock about fast transports got me wondering, if a group of enterprising individuals of sufficiently flexible morality were able to get their hands on an Abdiel-class mine-layer post-World War II, would they be able to make good use of it as a smuggling vessel or blockade runner? Theoretically, yes, but practically it would be insanely difficult, because with something like the Abdiel class, you would need a fairly large number of people with the fairly significant skills to maintain and operate the thing. And, smuggling and blockade runner groups are generally not known for being able to put together several hundred highly skilled sailors and obviously steam turbine and boiler engineers for considerable periods of time. So that's a bit of a hurdle to practically getting things off the ground. But if we conclude, for the sake of argument, that somehow they are able to summon this crew out of somewhere, you've got an additional problem of, well, the Abdiel class is armed, and they're probably not going to want to sell you one with the gun still there. So you are going to be talking about a disarmed vessel, which is very expensive to run. So you're probably going to have to be running very high value cargo. But with all that said, if you have a disarmed Abdiel and have somehow got a crew together that can run the thing, I think whether you'd be able to pull off then a smuggling or blockade running career would very much depend on where you were doing it. If you were trying to smuggle or blockade run somehow in the US, the Europe, etc., you're probably not going to have a huge amount of success, because this kind of ship is very, very easily identifiable. And yes, you're going to be faster than 99.9% of ships out there, but in a post-World War II environment, there's aircraft and there's helicopters, and you can't outrun those. So you probably would be caught fairly quickly. Conversely, if you took your ship out to various parts of the world where perhaps there aren't as many modern aircraft and helicopters, and perhaps law enforcement is a little bit more flexible in its morality as well, places like, South America, the various recently liberated or in the process of liberation parts of Africa, etc., etc. In those areas, at that point, I think you probably could make a fairly good living, because there'll be so little in terms of enforcement, even assuming you can't just bribe them not to enforce against you, that you could use your speed to sail in somewhere, drop off a bunch of high-value goods, get paid, and get out of there before the one vessel of that nation's navy actually shows up from 20 miles up the coast. Felicity Longus asks, I grew up and currently live relatively nearby to Mystic Seaport Museum in Mystic, Connecticut. For those not familiar, this is a recreation of a 19th century port town serving as a living history museum with demonstrations of trades and activities important to life in a maritime town. The museum hosts a range of sailing ships, including the whaler Charles W. Morgan, the smack Emma C. Berry, and the schooner L. A. Dunton. The whole museum covers around 19 acres. If you were to establish a similar museum of roughly the same size in a location of your choosing and with unlimited funding, what era, century, etc. would you set it in? What 3 ships would you choose to either relocate or recreate for the public to view? And what sorts of live demonstrations would you like to have for visitors? I was racking my brains up for an answer to this question until I saw the bit unlimited funding, at which point my mind was made up pretty much immediately, and it would be set in the mid to late 1930s, in the period of rearmament, probably find one of the unused or discontinued use shipyards that were closed down either during the 30s or somewhat thereafter, that's still somewhat not open as in the yard is open, but open as in hasn't been completely redeveloped, and repurpose that. And in terms of the ships I would relocate or recreate, I'd get the Black Swan class sloop Wimbrel back off of the Egyptians and put her in there as a memorial to the anti-submarine effort, because of course she is a sister ship to the Starling. I would recreate a Tribal class destroyer in its original fit-out form, both for obviously people to tour, and also since I'm recreating it from scratch, it can theoretically move and give people interesting tours of the harbour or maybe the open sea. Plus, it again will be quite a good platform to tell the story of the various destroyer flotillas in the Second World War. There's a few museum subs and ships and so forth, smaller things like X-Craft and so forth in various other museums I might try beg or borrow from them. But the centerpiece, with my unlimited funding, would be a dry dock, theoretically a graving dock at this point, where I would be recreating, of course, HMS Warspite in her refitted form. So essentially, it would start off as actually rebuilding a copy of the ship, but once it gets up to a certain point, it's going to also be a kind of a living recreation of her modernization. So people in the first few years of being at the museum will actually see an entire Queen Elizabeth class battleship being built from the keel up and eventually floated into the dry dock, which I think would be really cool. And therefore, the live demonstrations that you'd have for visitors would all be centered around this. So you'd have live sailings of the recreated Tribal class. I think I'd probably have a technical demonstration, obviously in an enclosed environment because you'll need goggles, showing the difference between welding and riveting and the strengths and weaknesses of both. Obviously, they'll initially, for the first few years, be the ongoing live demonstration of a battleship under construction. And once it's finished, then you can have demonstrations of all the turrets and various other guns turning, etc. Work out some way to fire blank charges as well for fun. I think I'd also have a little underwater tank experience where maybe build sort of a whole bunch of maybe 2 to 3 foot long replicas of torpedoes, and then you would take your torpedo, you would have a little educational experience about how you set the depth and the speed and the course of the torpedoes. Then you take your little, probably Allen key at that point, and make the appropriate adjustments to your torpedo, which would then be loaded into a little torpedo tube. Now, of course, to avoid undue risk to the public, these things would be powered by compressed air, and they would be uncharged when they go into the torpedo tube. Then the torpedo tube would have its own compressed air system, so it would charge the torpedo up, and then the torpedo would be fired out into a tank, which obviously would have to have clear water maintenance of swimming pool-like conditions, and essentially if you like, the bow of the submarine you're launching your torpedo out of would mostly be clear perspex, so visitors could watch their torpedo being launched, and you'd see the underwater profiles of a variety of ships. Maybe they'd move, maybe they wouldn't, and you could watch as your torpedo goes off and see, what did you hit, and if you hit anything at all, and how successful were your settings. And obviously you can have a bunch of different torpedo tubes set up to launch the torpedoes, and then every few hours the staff would recover the torpedoes from the other end of the pool and dry them off and put them back for reuse. There's loads of other stuff I could think of, but that's what immediately comes to mind. Sage of Irrelevance asks, in Season 2, Episode 2 of One Piece live action, there's a scene where the Straw Hat Pirates are sailing their ship, the Going Merry, through an extremely powerful current, as in powerful enough to carry their ship up a mountain. While trying to steer the ship through some rocks, the ship's tiller breaks, and the navigator orders the mizzenmast to be rigged as an alternate form of steering. Could a sailing ship actually use its masts to steer when the rudder failed? And if you've watched the live-action One Piece, what are your thoughts? I've not watched One Piece, live-action or not. However, in general terms of using a mizzen-mast as a form of steering, without commenting on the plausibility of that particular scenario, technically speaking, it would be possible, simply because the ship's centre of rotation is obviously considerably forward of where the mizzenmast is. So if the mizzenmast and only the mizzenmast, i.e. your foremast and mainmast sails have been furled, is providing some kind of propulsive force, then unless it's absolutely dead centre behind the ship and the ship is perfectly balanced, you will have some form of force acting either to port or starboard. But exactly how effective that's going to be depends on how your mizzenmast is rigged. So, for example, in this photo, as you can see, this is HMS Ganges, painting really. She's got a fore and aft rig sail, well, 2 sails technically, on her mizzenmast. This would be far better than a mizzenmast that was purely rigged with a square sail, because, of course, at that point, if, say, the wind is coming in significantly from port or starboard, then this fore and aft sail is going to catch it, and that's going to provide quite a bit of horizontal force kicking the stern around, which could allow you to steer to a certain degree by essentially going, okay, either we're going to accept this wind coming in from that side, or we're going to rotate the mast so it doesn't, or rotate the sails particularly. You don't rotate the entire mast, you rotate the yards. But on top of that, in theory, with a fore to aft sail setup, you could, even if the wind was, say, coming off of your port quarter, you could maneuver it such that you got a force that would actually push you to port instead of push you to starboard, as long as you got enough play in your rigging. With all that said, there are a few major problems with this. First, of course, is the strength and direction of the wind may change. You've got a fairly large ship to move, so it's all going to be fairly unpredictable and very difficult to manage. And, of course, all this is doing is managing your direction. If you then decide that you're going to actually want to move forward under anything other than just drifting with the currents, you are going to have to unfurl some of your sails up, on the main or foremasts, and when you do that, or fore and aft sails on the bowsprit, like you can see here, then that is going to change where the forces acting on the ship are. Now, you will get some propulsive effect, obviously, out of all of that, but it does mean that because you have different forces acting forward, mostly of the centre of rotation of the ship, the effect of steering with your mizzenmast is going to be much reduced. So it's one of those sort of, yes, you can technically do it, it's probably going to end extremely badly for you, though. Larry G asks, could you discuss Gibraltar as a naval base through the period the channel covers? How effectively were the base and ships in the harbour defended? And how useful were the land-based artillery and ships based there in attacking ships trying to pass through the straits? Generally speaking, Gibraltar was incredibly well defended, at least during the period that the British owned it. It was obviously originally founded by the Moors when they were in charge of the lower portion of Spain. The Spanish obviously then took it over. And for the Spanish, it was a useful base, but it was of less importance, because after they ended up taking Ceuta off of the Portuguese, they controlled both sides of the Gibraltar Straits, and of course they controlled the entire Spanish coastline. So the fact they had a base that happened to be right in the middle of the Straits of Gibraltar, it was like, well, we got like 2 or 3 of those, and bases on either side. So it wasn't as important for them, although still somewhat important. Then, of course, the British rock up and they're like, well, this is sitting right at the heart of the Straits of Gibraltar. We're going to take it off you and do so. And then, obviously, they control it. And that's when it becomes really, really important, because for the Spanish, it's a thorn in their side. And for the British, it's the key to keeping the Mediterranean open to them, at least as long as the Mediterranean isn't absolutely crawling with enemy warships to the extent it outnumbers them. But once the British get their hands on it, they significantly upgrade its fortifications, and it continues to have its fortifications upgraded, which is why if you visit Gibraltar today, you can actually visit multiple generations and layers of fortifications. So initially, The fortifications are mostly concentrated in and around the town itself, with a few isolated gun batteries around the base of the rock. There is an old Moorish castle about halfway up. You can kind of see it's kind of the white splash centre left on the rock at the moment, not the big one up the top left. But as time goes on, bearing in mind obviously you also have the threat of potential Spanish invasion by land, the British fortify it more and more. So there's gun galleries built into the rock itself, particularly on the north face, because that's where most of the threat is. And then as you get into the ironclad age, you get heavier guns installed. So some of the 100-ton guns are installed there. One of them is actually still there and accessible as a museum. It's kind of center lower right, if you're looking at it from this perspective. And then as guns get longer and longer range, obviously then it becomes more and more useful to put them not just in batteries lower down in the more flat areas of Gibraltar, but also up on the rock itself. So you get 9.2-inch and 5.5-inch guns and 5.25-inch guns and so forth installed all along the top. And if you visit the rock, you can go and see them. Although, word of advice from somebody who walked up and down that thing 3 times in the summer heat before he was, got far enough down the rock to realise it, there is actually a cable car service, which is much, much easier than walking up the blasted thing. And, well, Gibraltar withstood multiple sieges by the French and the Spanish, so that gives you some idea of how effectively it was defended in the Age of Sail, and as I said, they continue to upgrade the defences. So it continued to be pretty well defended, both from land and sea, by World War II. In case of invasion, there were plans, obviously, one, to make any invasion force pay significantly for their invasion, but secondly, in the event that the invasion was successful, they had all sorts of backups to continue resistance and intel from within the rock, even after the main part of Gibraltar had been taken over. And yeah, I do not envy anyone trying to take Gibraltar by land in World War II, because although Gibraltar is very small, you can kind of see here on the left-hand side, there's just this massive sheer face of rock full of guns pointing at you over a very narrow, very flat approach. And even assuming you somehow make it across that, again, as you can see, there is a very narrow portion of flat land where you can go then past the face of the rock, and then you get to the rest of the fortifications in the town. Nowadays, pretty much anything flat or slightly sloped that you can see has been urbanized, but this is roughly what it looked like back in the first half of the 20th century. I do need to do a whole video, or possibly a series of videos on it. I have got a bunch of footage from Gibraltar from a few years ago, but I need to go back and get some more. Now, in terms of the land-based artillery and ships, how useful were they in terms of attacking ships trying to pass through the straits? During the Age of Sail and into the early Age of Steam, they were more of a deterrent. So the gun batteries couldn't reach all the way out across the straits. If you wanted to avoid them, you could just sail down the middle or further towards the African coast. But the ships, of course, could come out and attack you because, hey, the rock is a really good lookout point. You can see stuff coming from miles away. Tell your ships that to go and intercept them, and then you're in trouble. So the one limitation was that Gibraltar didn't support a massive fleet back then. It supported a decent-sized force, but not 30, 40 ships of the line at a time. So for people like the French or the Spanish, it was possible to sail through the Straits of Gibraltar by one of two means. Either you go through at night, when obviously in the 18th, 19th century it's not possible to see that you're doing so, or two, you go through in strength, because if the British have 6, 7, 8 ships there and you go through with 30, well, obviously it would be a bit stupid to try and fight you, but you can report that they've passed. But it does limit the ability of the Franco-Spanish forces to pass through to just very large fleets, not kind of generic back and forth with small squadrons and frigates and so forth, which would be very useful to them. But once you get to the latter part of the 19th century and then into the 20th century, the installation of much bigger guns and, of course, torpedoes and torpedo boats and so forth means that the defences now can actually command the entirety of the straits. They can range all the way across the straits. There's no way you're getting through with a surface vessel without being fired upon and without potentially being engaged by an increasingly strong Royal Navy presence in Gibraltar itself. And their guns can fire from dock and hit you wherever you are in the straits as well, let alone actually coming out to finish you off up close and personal. So At that point, the, if you like, control element of the Gibraltar artillery batteries actually becomes significantly greater. Although, of course, then the flip side is that once submarines are developed, the submarines can pass through just by submerging, because then you can't see them and you can't shoot at them. But even that is fraught with risk, because the distance that you have to cover and the currents involved means that you have to time your passage very, very carefully. And of course, there can be anti-submarine escorts coming out from Gibraltar to look for you as well. And that's why some U-boats do manage to get into the Mediterranean in World War II, but a lot more of them don't, and virtually none of them get back out again. Felipe asks, what are some of your favourite or most interesting close-quarters naval engagements in the age of steam and steel? Well, the fun part is that practically every engagement up to and including the Spanish-American War in the age of steam and steel are close-quarters naval engagements, simply because you can't actually hit anything beyond close quarters at that point. You know, we're talking a few hundred yards, maybe 1,000 yards if you're lucky, for the most part. Of course, once you get past that to the Russo-Japanese War and so forth, ranges start increasing, and what becomes considered close quarters changes dramatically. So, for example, when Duke of York ambushes Scharnhorst at the Battle of the North Cape, the range is opened, as in Duke of York fires, at about 12,000 yards, which for that time is considered point-blank range, whereas 30 years before, 12,000 yards would have been in the realm of extreme proponents of long-distance fire, and 40 years before, it would have been considered complete madness. So if I restrict myself to the pre-1900s era, so 1860 to 1900, there's a lot to choose from, surprisingly. While there aren't any major wars, as in global wars, there are still quite a lot of individual conflicts. But I think I actually rather like the Battle of Angamos, which is where the Huascar is captured by the Chileans, because it involves all sorts of weapons, all sorts of ship designs, from essentially encapsulating most of the first 2 decades of ironclad and steam-propelled warship design. And it is a very knockdown, drag-out brawl. They're having to get closer and closer to each other to try and make their shots work. There's an awful lot of maneuvering involved, and it is a really, really big test of some of the first proper armor-piercing ammunition, as opposed to just, solid shot we threw at somebody really hard. And it's a genuinely interesting battle as well, just in overall tactics and the situation that's led up to it. So I think that probably would be one of my favourite, most interesting. Of course, the Battle of Lissa, although it involves a number of unarmoured vessels as well, is also very interesting, considering the complete madhouse it descends into. Seb Dove asks, can you tell me about the Dutton Rescue of 1796, as my dad has been reading about Pellew after I gave him his book, and he has become a big fan of his adventures. The Dutton Rescue, I think, is one of the most underappreciated acts of heroism in the Age of Sail by anyone. And Pellew does so many things, and this barely gets a mention. So, for context, obviously, this is a painting of the incident. At this point in his life, he's in command of the Rasay frigate Indefatigable, which is put into Plymouth for a refit. Pellew has gone to have dinner with one of the locals, and so he and his wife are dressed in their dinner finest when somebody says, there's a wreck, or a ship that's gone aground, it's being wrecked, which is the East Indiaman Dutton with several hundred people on board. Pellew decides, I'm going to go and help. This is Plymouth. This is a fairly large naval base and port. There's lots of ships. There's lots of people. Theoretically, this should be handled. But no, Pellew decides, stuff the weather. As you can see, it's not exactly pleasant. It's a storm. It's driven the ship ashore in the first place. He just runs down there and finds that the senior crew of the East Indiaman have managed to rig a single line from the ship to the shore, taken that line, gone ashore, and abandoned everybody else on board to their fate. Pellew says to them, look, you need to go back on board and sort this situation out. They refuse. He then says, okay, I will pay you to go back on board and sort the situation out. They refuse still. He finds some local pilots. Look, can you get me out to the ship? They refuse. Basically, everyone has written off everyone who's still aboard as lost. And so Pellew just takes a look at this whole situation and goes, oh, stuff this for a laugh. And still, I remind you, not even in his naval uniform, in the middle of a raging storm with 20 to 30-foot swells of waves, wearing a dinner suit and a sword, because of course that's part of your dinner suit, he just climbs onto the one rope that has already been rigged and climbs onto the ship. So he goes from shore through the storm water, aboard the Dutton, rocks up and says, right, I'm in command now. If you want to live, you follow my instructions. Some of the people on board, having decided they were going to die, had already gotten themselves drunk on the ship's liquor. But he just turns around and says, look, either you listen to my commands or you die. If you choose to die, you can either die when the ship breaks up and you all drown horribly, or I can kill you right here, right now with my sword if you get in the way of my efforts. Shockingly, people decide they're actually going to mostly obey his orders. The fact that by this point he is already a national hero kind of helps. I mean, imagine you're on this ship, you've been driven ashore, you've been abandoned by the crew, you think you're going to die within sight of your home soil as the ship is smashed to pieces around you. And then suddenly this guy who in the newspapers is essentially a period superhero suddenly shows up. And so he starts organising a rescue, and it says something to the credit of the crew of the Indefatigable. Even though they don't actually know that Pellew is on board, they see the distress that the Dutton is in once it gets reported to them over in Plymouth, and they try to send boats out from the Indefatigable to help. They're not successful because of the strength of the storm, but other ships also start to send boats out. And so a merchant ship's boat shows up and starts to help. A couple of other boats will eventually show up as well. And between them ferrying people and Pellew's instructions, they manage to relay the women, the children, and the sick via the boats. And people who are fitter, he actually rigs up a set of additional lines with carry cots to move people to and from, well, mostly from the ship. And you end up with a growing party of people ashore as well who want to help but don't have access to a boat. And they manage the lines on the shore side. And despite the fact that this Indiaman is badly overloaded with people at the time she goes aground, he actually manages to get everybody off. According to most reports, no one actually dies. And he tells them, as part of a way to inspire confidence, look, I voluntarily climbed aboard this ship. I'm not leaving till all of you are off safe. And indeed, he keeps that word. He does have to beat a couple of people with his sword to get them to stay in line, but he eventually is one of the last off of the ship. And, well, it just adds to his legend. And then, of course, comes back ashore and goes back to dinner, because why not? Archie Freeman asks, in your opinion, by 1939, who was the more powerful, the US Navy or the Royal Navy? Or were they on parity with each other like the naval treaties intended? By the standards of the time, in 1939, actually the Royal Navy was somewhat more powerful than the US Navy, believe it or not. Yes, as you say, the treaties said they should be on parity. However, the British had a number of advantages. Firstly, in terms of their capital units, so their battle line and their carriers. Carriers were a little bit more of a difficult one because the British had more carrier hulls than the Americans did. However, of course, the majority of the American carriers were bigger and could carry more aircraft. But in 1939, the carrier aircraft were significantly less capable than they would be in 1941. Just look at the planes that were actually flying. But so, of course, the Americans could put more aircraft into the air. The British had a little bit more resilience. I think overall the Americans had an advantage in aircraft carriers, period, in terms of their actual capability. But as I said, the actual capability is nowhere near as strong as it would be a couple of years later. Battle line-wise, the British do have a decided advantage in that the weakest unit they have is a Revenge-class battleship, so it's a super dreadnought with 15-inch guns, and, well, there are 10 of those of varying descriptions in their battle line, including Warspite, which has just been modernised, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant are under modernisation. You have a modernised Renown, unmodernised Repulse plus Hood plus Nelson plus Rodney. So compared to that, while of course you have the Colorados and the Tennessee's been quite powerful at the upper end of things because the King George V and North Carolinas are still under production, the fastest American battleship in 1939 is 21 knots. The slowest British capital ship in 1939 is 21 knots. The Queen Elizabeths are faster than that. The Nelsons are faster than that. Renown, Repulse, and Hood are considerably faster than that. And technically, if they could actually get the boilers fixed, even the R-class would be faster than that, but then they're not. And obviously then at the lower end of things, you have our poor old Arkansas with 12-inch guns. And while Texas, New York, and Nevada and Oklahoma are certainly no slouches, they are also somewhat behind on paper compared to something like a Queen Elizabeth or a Revenge. So overall battle line strength and capability is definitely in the Royal Navy's favour. Cruiser-wise, the British have considerably more cruisers. The Americans have, depending on which part of the cruiser arm you look at, either more capable or less capable cruisers. So some of their latest stuff, like Wichita and the New Orleans class, you can argue is definitely on a par with or better than the county class, depending on which county you're looking at, because of course the county refits are coming along as well. And of course the British also have the Hawkins and York classes, which are somewhat less capable. But at the other end of things, the US have things like the Pensacola's, which essentially don't have armour. They're not quite as bad as the French, who genuinely don't have armour, but the Pensacola's, for long-range fire control purposes, don't have protection against similar guns. And then similarly with light cruisers, the British have a whole slew of different light cruisers, including, of course, the very capable Town class. You can make a decent argument that in a straight-up gunfight, having an extra 3 guns on the Brooklyns does make them a superior ship, but there aren't as many Brooklyns in 1939 as there are Towns, and the only other light cruisers the US have are the Omahas, which are a little bit behind compared to even the Leanders. And then you look at destroyers. The US has a lot of destroyers, obviously, because it also can call on the Clemson and Wickses. But if you actually look at modern destroyers, so starting with the Farragut class for the US and the A and B class for the British actually have considerably more modern interwar destroyers than the Americans do, by a factor of at least 50%. As I say, the Americans do make up those numbers by the sheer number of Wickses and Clemsons that they have available, but they are older and less capable vessels. And you could go on with submarines and auxiliaries and so on and so forth. But yeah, generally speaking, at the outbreak of World War II, on paper, the Royal Navy generally has either a slight or major advantage in pretty much all categories of surface combatant, with the exception of aircraft carriers. Now, as time goes on and more and better carrier aircraft are introduced, that's going to matter a lot more in a theoretical matchup. But I would argue in 1939, when US carrier tactics are, let's just say, not particularly brilliant, and US carrier aircraft are, for the most part, a generation behind the ones that you'll see fighting in 41, 42, it's not as much of a concern as it would be a couple of years down the line. A.B. Coates asks, considering how comparatively small and inefficient it was, I'm having a hard time understanding how the Kriegsmarine surface fleet thought it could seriously challenge the Royal Navy beyond the odd tactical victory like sinking Hood or Glowworm. What did German High Command think their Navy was capable of doing in September 1939? How realistic was that belief? And how close did it come to achieving its full potential? If we're talking about purely the surface fleet, without obviously referencing the U-boat arm, to be fair, the German Naval High Command was pretty realistic in evaluating its chances of fighting the Royal Navy, especially considering, of course, the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale were allied against it, and at that point Germany hadn't got any other allies in the war because Italy was staying out of it. Japan wasn't going to come in until obviously late 41, and they didn't know that Japan was going to come in at that point. So it was just the Kriegsmarine versus the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale. And as far as they were concerned, German Naval High Command just went, yeah, we aren't beating them in a straight-up fight. Everything we do has to rely on sneakery and basically not being where most of the enemy are. So you see that with attempts to pre-position ships like the Graf Spee, and of course they started construction on the first generation of Hilfkreuzer and everything. So they haven't thrown their hands up in despair completely. They are looking at what they could actually do, and that mostly consists of hoping to hit merchant shipping before the Allies can organise either serious hunting groups or serious escort forces. But they're very aware that most of their hopes rest on needling and inflicting small losses and running away whenever any significant enemy opposition is encountered. And for the most part, hoping that the U-boat arm can do something, even though, again, they're not massively hopeful in 39. They know how effective U-boats can be, but they also know they don't have anywhere near as many U-boats as they ideally want for an underwater campaign. And that's why, even right from the beginning, you have these very, very restrictive orders placed on German commanders to essentially only fight when they have absolutely certain chances of victory, and even then to be very, very careful about things. So, in the Norwegian campaign, for example, which was the Kriegsmarine's essentially first major outing in strength, it almost entirely relies on being stealthy and not engaging. And when you do get the occasional large engagement, like, say, when Scharnhorst and Gneisenau take on Glorious and sink it, as I mentioned before, in almost all other naval circumstances, in any other naval service, taking out one of the enemy's fleet carriers using a pair of ships like the Scharnhorsts would be applauded. Now, granted, okay, they were damaged by return torpedo fire from the Scharnhorst escort, but overall, considering that both ships made it back, it's a net win, and a fairly significant net win. As far as the Germans are concerned, however, Admiral Marschall was completely irresponsible for taking his ships into a situation where there was even a chance of them getting torpedoed, and so he's essentially fired. He just won probably the most decisive surface action of the war that involved the Kriegsmarine actually winning, aside from the Battle of Denmark Strait, which at that point hadn't happened yet, and they fired him for it, simply because it went against orders to even engage Glorious in the first place, and technically, yes, he had gotten his ship somewhat damaged. So yeah, I think they had a fairly good idea about their true capabilities relative to their opponents. In terms of achieving their full potential, this thing, the Kriegsmarine shouldn't, on paper, have been able to pull off the Norwegian campaign. The fact that they did is a big mark in their favour. The fact that it cost them an awful lot of their fighting strength is, of course, a bit of a mark against. So, there's the optimal outcome, there's the likely outcome, and they landed somewhere between the two, considerably better than expected, but still costing a lot. But I think they did miss a few tricks here and there. Essentially, and it's the same thing with the Japanese, to be honest, when it comes to you have the smaller navy, realistically, if you want to achieve significant success, you kind of have to go double or nothing. You can understand why people would be cautious and want to preserve their ships for some future theoretical situation where they could use them most decisively. But realistically, that's never actually worked out for anyone in recorded history, for the most part. If you want to have a sort of a natural, proper effect on the war, you have to take risks, and you have to take big risks, because when you've got a fleet like the Kriegsmariners in 3940, you can't win a straight-up engagement, but you have just enough power that if you concentrate a good chunk of that in one place, you could win an overwhelming victory against an isolated portion of the enemy. And unlike World War I, when the British had basically contracted anything worth shooting at into the Grand Fleet, there were various isolated British capital units, cruiser squadrons, etc., that, say, a combined group of the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Hipper, Blücher, maybe throw Admiral Scheer and Lutzow in there as well, plus some of their escorts, and heck, maybe even some Königsbergs to at least be piñatas for the Royal Navy, would be an overwhelming force for anything that wasn't the combined forces of the home fleet. But, of course, the risk then is if you do put them all in one place, you might end up fighting the entirety of the home fleet, and then you lose everything in one afternoon. But that's the kind of risk you have to take. If it works really well. If it doesn't, you lose. But to be honest, at that point, you're probably going to lose anyway, so you might as well go down with glory. Monsquire wants to eventually buy a C-117RG asks, the Western Front Association has a great series on World War I. One of their videos recounts the recollection of Commander Gunther Paschen, gunnery officer on SMS Lutzow. His vivid recollections of the sinking of the Queen Mary and hits on both Invincible and Lion. He described the hits on Lion and the destruction of No. 3 turret, and this led him to conclude that a good amount of the ship damage done to the Grand Fleet was the result of improper handling of powder charges, resulting in the massive explosions and ship destruction. With the information now available, do you think he was fundamentally correct in his theory? I think with all the information we have available today, and obviously counteracting some of the mythology that's set in, if we take his recollections and conclusions as a kind of a slightly broader, there was something wrong with British ammunition, then yes, it is fundamentally correct. However, in terms of specifically improper handling of the propellant charges, as I've covered in various videos, while that was a very commonly circulated conclusion, at least in public, and to a certain extent still is, you'll still find people going, oh yes, well, clearly the British just had cordite charges everywhere. Again, as I've covered, the situation, I think, is a little bit more complex than that. Certainly there is some evidence that on some British ships, the charges were being improperly handled and stacked up in places they shouldn't be. However, there's also equal amounts of evidence that in other British ships this practice either wasn't happening or it had been happening, but prior to Jutland had been discovered and told, knock it off. But then there is, there's improper handling as in goes against regulations, and then there's improper handling as in technically within the regulations, but fundamentally unsafe. And we know, for example, from various written orders and even diagrams of the turrets, that while the ships were, these are the British ships, were originally designed to, for obvious reasons, have all of their ammunition stored in their magazines, they were later modified to carry some ammunition, depending on the ship in question, either in the gun house itself, i.e. what you would think of as the turret, or in the handling room, which is immediately below the turret, where the design allows for this. And as I say, there are literally diagrams showing here is where the shell lockers are, right up in the, what broadly speaking you would describe as the turret, although sometimes it is that handling room that's in the very, very top of the barbette. Nonetheless, you kind of get the point. That kind of ammunition handling is not technically improper, because that is exactly what you have been ordered to do, but it is obviously improper in terms of safety, because, well, obvious reasons there. But against that, you also have the fact that, to be honest, by the time most of the British ships that are destroyed actually explode, by any reasonable standard, the 5 to 10 rounds or so that would have been stored in those areas would have already been fired. Now, there may be a bit of a build-up, maybe a couple of rounds still there, but not enough to necessarily explain the catastrophic explosions that you do see. And I think this is where you also need to divide things up a bit. When you look at, let's just say for the sake of argument, the three big British losses, Invincible, Indefatigable, and Queen Mary, and to a certain degree also Lion's turret, although Lion herself isn't lost. Indefatigable, particularly, is so poorly protected against major caliber gunfire that she could have had the world's best ammunition handling practices, and she still probably would have gone up like a candle as she did, simply because the armour over her fore and aft turrets and the magazines was completely inadequate to fight 11 and 12-inch guns. It was marginal against armoured cruisers, but against even long-distance gunfire from 11 and 12-inch guns, she could very well have just straight up taken a magazine hit, and that would have been it. And obviously, pending very close examination of the wreck, we'll never know exactly where those hits took place. Although, of course, magazine explosions tend to destroy all the evidence in the immediate vicinity by their very nature. So with Indefatigable, I don't think you can strictly say that improper handling of ammo is responsible for her loss, because one, we don't know exactly what her ammo and her handling was like, and two, as I said, it was equally possible that just she was straight up shot in the magazines. With Invincible, ironically enough, although she is slightly older than Indefatigable, because she has uniform 6-inch armour, she's actually slightly better protected. However, she actually falls into the same boat as Indefatigable, in as much as when she's fighting Lutzow, she's doing so at such a range that the 6-inch armour really only serves as a fuse activator for incoming 12-inch rounds. So again, in theory, if her turrets were stacked with cordite, it's possible that could be the main contributory cause to her loss. However, we don't have, again, direct evidence of that, and again, the 12-inch gunfire would be perfectly capable at that kind of range of just punching straight into her magazines and blowing her up, which obviously she did blow up. It's Queen Mary and Lion that you really have to look at, because both of those theoretically have armour that should suffice to protect them against incoming shell fire from the Germans. But in Queen Mary's case, spectacularly doesn't, and in Lion's case, although it takes a little bit of a delay, it's still pretty bad. But in those cases, I think, and potentially also for Invincible and Indefatigable, although as we just covered, they didn't really need the help, I think there is a more convincing case to be made, which is the one that I've made previously, which is to do with the use of older expired cordite and near expired cordite that tended to sweat out a nitroglycerin crystal dust combination mix, which then set a very incendiary fine powder everywhere. And if those charges are on board, then actually, if the ships had been hit at the beginning of the fight, they might actually have been at less risk, because at that point, theoretically at least, they should be fairly clean. Whereas when they're well into the fight and they've shot off a number of salvos, every single time one of these slightly aged or cordite charges has been passed from the magazine through the shell hoist and up into the gun turrets, it's been leaving this fine trail of high explosive behind it. And the more and more charges get passed, the more and more this builds up, and then all it takes is one hit to the turret and, a decently hot spark or a bit of penetration, some kind of flame-causing thing, and suddenly all the started up highly inflammatory explosive dust that's in the air goes up, and down it goes, and up goes the ship. Kirsendarken asks, letters of marque, what actual entity did they tend to be tied to? A specific ship, owner, captain, crew, or other? Were they transferable upon the death of or destruction of that entity? For example, if a letter was issued to a specific captain and that captain died during a voyage, could the crew continue operations under its auspices, or would the voyage have to be cut short? And if it's not too long, could you read us an example of an actual letter? The detail varies between nations very slightly. So most of the time, a letter of marque and reprisal will name both the commander of the ship and the ship itself, and usually detail some information about that vessel. To what degree, obviously, it varies. But if you are being issued a letter of marque by the British, for example, that is tied more to the person. So if a person is issued a letter of marque, it will also mention the vessel they're going out on, but obviously if they happen to at some point have to switch vessel or change the specifications of the vessel, the letter of marque is still valid because it is tied to the captain. Whereas for American letters of marque, although they are also addressed to the captain, they are actually, legally speaking, much more closely tied to the ship. So if the ship is lost, technically speaking, that letter of marque is no longer valid. But if the captain is killed and the first officer takes over, then, well, the letter of marque is tied to the vessel, so they can continue. Whereas for the British, if the bearer of the letter of marque is killed, you, again, in theory, would have to head back. I mean, his duly appointed successor, his first lieutenant, would be able to take over and continue the voyage, but it would be a case of okay, you can complete that voyage, essentially in the name of the deceased captain, but then you have to come back and get a new letter of marque. And in terms of the length, letters of marque actually, although initially individually written for specific captains and voyages, you do actually later get mass-produced letters of marque with just little spaces left in them to fill in, which is great in some ways because it means it's all typeset except for those key entries. But it then also means that the filled-in details in pen are very often very difficult to actually make out, which is a little bit annoying. American letters of marque tend to be somewhat shorter than British ones, so in the interest of time, I'm going to read you a letter of marque that was issued in 1776 by the US Continental Congress to the Northampton. And so it says, in Congress, the delegates of the United Colonies of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the counties of Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex, I think, on Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, to all unto whom these presents shall come, send greetings. Know ye that we have granted by these presents and by these presents do grant license and authority to James Powell, mariner and commander of the schooner called the Northampton, of the burthen of 30 tons or thereabouts, belonging to somebody, John someone or other, of Northampton in the colony of Virginia, mounting, looks like possibly 5 carriage guns, and navigated by, looks like 30 men. These are the handwritten bits, which are harder to read. And fit out and set forth in the said schooner in a warlike manner, and by and with the said Powell, and the crew thereof, by force of arms, to attack, seize, and take the ships and other vessels belonging to the inhabitants of Great Britain, or any of them, with their tackle, apparel, furniture, and ladings, on the high seas, or between high water and low water marks, and to bring the same to some convenient ports in the said colonies, in order that the courts which are or shall be there appointed to hear and determine causes civil and maritime may proceed in due form to condemn the said captures. If they being adjudged lawful prize, the said James Powell having given bond and sufficient sureties that nothing be done by the said James Powell or any of the officers, mariners, or company thereof, contrary to or inconsistent with the usages and customs of nations, and the instructions, a copy of which is herewith delivered to him. And we will and require all our officers whatsoever to give succour and assistance to the said James Powell in the premise. This commission shall continue in force until the Congress shall issue orders to the contrary, dated Virginia Colonies, October 24th, 1776, by order of Congress, and it's actually signed John Hancock, President. So that's an American letter of marque. The British one's about 3 times as long. Farender Ritter asks, in the age of sail, how did the Royal Navy attract crews and officers for colonial postings or patrols, since the risk of death by disease was much greater depending on location, such as the Caribbean or South America or Africa? A wide variety of measures, depending on if you're in peacetime or wartime. So, in peacetime, which is more when you're trying to attract recruits more than anything, what you could do, for example, is highlight that if a particular vessel had perhaps already been on that station and was sailing under the same captain and had managed to not suffer any casualties or suffer very low casualties, that might be highlighted on the advertisement, assuming that the ship was obviously going to be recommissioned and sent back out to that area. Another way of doing it would be to offer additional pay, basically what we would call hazard pay these days, and that was certainly done at times. Another way was to have a moral incentive. So if, for example, that's why I chose this picture, with the West Africa Squadron, it was a known very dangerous position, but there was the moral impetus of helping to stamp out slavery, so that would be made quite clear in various advertisements, and then people who were prepared to accept the risk to do what they saw as a moral good would sign up. Another way, which is perhaps the more general way they tended to deal with stuff like this, would be just not to mention it at all. Because most of the time, certainly in the age of sail, it wasn't strictly that you were commissioning a ship for this one particular patrol on this one particular station. Sometimes that would happen, and obviously then that they would have to say that most of the time. But more often, it would be a kind of, oh, this ship is heading generally for the South Seas, or this ship is heading across the Atlantic, or something like that. Because when you signed up to a ship, you signed up for that ship's commission. So if, say, your ship left harbour and you were ordered to go and do patrols in the Western Atlantic, perhaps off the US coast or off near Canada, somewhere like that, fine, great. That's what the ship's orders are at the time that it's being commissioned. That's what everyone signs up for. But then, circumstances change, and a year into your commission, you get orders, okay, well, you're now redeploying to patrol off Bermuda. Well, you're part of the crew now, you're just following orders, and off you go to Bermuda. And from there, you might be assigned, obviously, to the Caribbean, to the West African coast, to the South American coast, and then you might be assigned to the Mediterranean, and then you might be assigned back up into the Atlantic, and then the ship's commission comes to an end and you go to being paid off. So it would just be part of your overall duties. And as I said, once you were part of the crew, there wasn't really a huge amount of choice involved. Silderin Machine Works asks, I recently listened to The King's Speech by Peter Conradi and Mark Logue about Lionel Logue, Mark's grandfather, being a speech therapist and close friend to Albert, Duke of York, later King George VI. In 1928, the Duke and Duchess Elizabeth were returning from opening the Australian Parliament aboard HMS Renown when she had a boiler room fire. The book implies that this was a serious issue and may have required evacuation of the ship. So what exactly happened there? Was the ship in such serious danger? Was Renown travelling alone, in company with other ships? Or were there potentially other ships nearby to which passengers and crew could have been evacuated? It was actually quite spectacular and potentially could have gotten into a fairly big mess. So I'll actually read the account of somebody who was aboard Renown at the time, and that will kind of explain exactly what happened. So the fire actually happens in 1927, not 1928. But in any case, he says, the fire broke out early in the afternoon watch in D boiler room, while the ship was steaming on C and D boilers. It subsequently transpired that the cause of the fire was oil fuel that was being transferred from forward to one of the double-bottom tanks in D boiler room. The filling arrangements were a standpipe with an open-ended funnel and a filling valve above. The stoker who was tending this valve made the cardinal error of sounding the wrong tank, so that as he could see no rise in the level, he kept opening the valve wider and wider until the tank and its standpipe were completely full and the oil overflowed, some of it striking the hot boiler front and catching fire. No one else in the boiler room was aware of what was happening, so the oil continued flowing at full bore into the boiler room so that the whole of the bilges were soon alight, and the steaming crew were driven out of the boiler room. Unfortunately, the boiler fans were still running and providing all the air necessary to keep the fire raging. Very soon news of the calamity spread around the ship, and the officers and men off watch came rushing to help. The officer of the watch at the time concentrated on keeping the forward four boilers in C boiler room alight, and this was no mean task as the after bulkhead was red hot and desultory fires kept breaking out in the bilges there. The main problem, of course, was to stop the source of air to D boiler room, because by now the oil fuel transfer pump had been shut off, but not before there was a layer of 3 to 4 feet of oil in the room. The senior engineer had taken charge and insisted on shutting off the steam to each of the 8 fans himself. Unfortunately, in the literal heat of the moment, he didn't foresee that the wing fans ought to be shut off first, and then the next outer ones, and so on, working in, at last, to the inner ones, where the only access to the fan flat from the deck above was. As it was, he shut off these inner ones first, so that the flames from the boiler room were able to come out through the fan inlets into the fan flat. Hoses, which had already been rigged, were turned on into the fan flat to try and make the conditions tolerable for the senior engineer, who was wrapped in wet towels, as he tried to battle his way past these flame spots to shut off the remaining fans. He would not accept assistance in what was now a very dangerous task, and wore himself out in repeated and unsuccessful attempts. Before going on to describe the subsequent events, I should like to interject that I learnt that day 2 very important lessons in leadership. The first being that the natural leader should deny himself the dangerous and exhausting jobs and concentrate on directing others in these, and to do them justice. There were and always are plenty of volunteers available and eager to take them on, provided they know they're being competently directed. The rest of us badly needed direction from the senior engineer, who had a complete and devastating knowledge of the whole engine room department. The second lesson was that in an emergency, it's the man with the knowledge who inevitably takes command. In a later stage of the fire, when we were trying to make sure none of the innumerable oil fuel tanks had caught fire, it was the stoker petty officer of the double bottom party who had to direct our efforts. A fine power of command is of no use if one hasn't a clue when to command. While indulging in that little homily, we've left the fire raging away with water from the hoses pouring in through the fan eyes, so that the layer of burning oil was rising steadily up the boiler fronts. It eventually reached to just below the steam drums, and of course the contents of that boiler room were completely ruined. Although we never succeeded in shutting off all the fans, we did eventually manage to fit shutters and canvas screens that almost completely blocked the passage of air from the air intakes to the upper decks. In case anyone is wondering why we didn't use the master shut-off valves for the fans and oil pumps and oil supply to the boilers fitted outside the machinery space, the answer is, of course, there were none at the time, and it was because of this fire in Renown that thereafter they were fitted in all ships. The senior watchkeeper had been told to light up the boilers in F boiler room, and was busily employed there, since it took several hours in those days, and even in this emergency it was over 2 hours before these boilers were connected to take the load off the 4 remaining boilers in C boiler room. Incidentally, and rather comically as it appeared afterwards, steam was also raised in the Royal Barge, although we were thousands of miles from anywhere. The forward bulkhead in E boiler room was naturally red hot and an alarming sight, but after we had rigged hoses to keep it under control, I went down to the engine room to be greeted by the warrant engineer with the words, "You're just in time, sir. The steering gear is broken down. The last drop of water has just gone out of the main feed tank. There's no steam for the main engines, and the bridge keeps ringing down asking when we'll be ready to proceed." However, it wasn't as hopeless as it seemed, and when at last F boilers were connected, I was able to reply to a further bridge inquiry now. We were in fact underway before the end of the afternoon watch, and I remember meeting a warrant engineer who had the middle watch and had had his head down prior to the first dog watch, emerging from his cabin and seeing hoses everywhere, saying, "What's going on? Has some silly idiot been having fire practice?" The only real trouble we had after that was our fortunately ill-founded suspicions that oil fuel tanks were on fire, and the difficulty we had in opening up D boiler room, since due to the stored heat, every time we let air in, the fire broke out again, so we had to let it cool off for some time. As a result of the Board of Inquiry that was held, alterations and additions were carried out and new construction modified so that 1. Open-ended funnels for tank filling were barred from boiler rooms, 2. External shut-off arrangements were made for steam to boiler room fans, steam to oil fuel pumps and heaters, and the oil fuel supply to each boiler, and also HMS Renown was re-engined shortly before the 39-45 war when I was at the Admiralty in the battleship section. HMS Renown carried out her contractor's sea trials on completion of re-engineering. We had considerable difficulty with these because she refused to maintain her vacuum during the astern trials, the vacuum dropping steadily until we lost our nerve at about 20 inches of vacuum and stopped the trials. On a repeat of these trials we went a little further and there was a resounding bang from one of the low-pressure turbines. Even before we could shut down, we noticed some recovery of vacuum, and opening up the turbine, we found one of the ties retaining the inner cylinder in place had fractured. Investigation showed this to be a redundant member, which had been distorting the casing and opening the horizontal joint. The remedy was to leave it broken and to cut similar ties in the other 3 low-pressure turbines, after which we had no further trouble with the vacuum when going astern. So yeah, it was an extremely unusual circumstance, potentially quite deadly, because if they hadn't managed to get it under control, it could have spread and left the ship completely powerless and ablaze. But yeah, there wasn't anywhere they could go, so you could evacuate the ship to the boats and hope for the best, because that's better than just burning to death, but you'd still, as he said, be thousands of miles away from anywhere, and, well, at least I suppose they'd all be manned by Royal Navy sailors and officers, so there's a decent chance they'd be able to navigate their way home. The Hand of Ray asks, why did Lexington and Saratoga have closed hurricane bows, but all subsequent carriers until the Forestals have open bows as designed? It's mostly to do with their nature as conversions of battle cruisers, and not just that, but conversions of battle cruisers that were substantially complete. Because if you look at a side profile of the Lexington-class's battle cruisers and the Lexington-class's carriers, you'll notice that the only real difference to the entire bow shape is 1 deck level has been added compared to if it was a battle cruiser, and that's the very, very, very top deck level. And of course, the hull was substantially complete when they were chosen for conversion. So if the hull is already enclosed, being a battlecruiser hull, then, well, you might as well just continue that for the flight deck. And bear in mind that, you can see with the bow here on the bottom left, the vast majority of the bow part in question that's being added in height terms is literally just the bit where it flares out from the battlecruiser hull to support the flight deck. So there's precious little point in making it all skeletonized and open because, well, what purpose is it going to serve? The other thing is, because of the exceptionally fine lines of the battlecruiser hull as compared to the slightly fuller lines you'll find on most aircraft carriers that are purpose-built, there's no ventilation benefit to it. You know, that you get minimal, if any, weight savings by just doing a single deck, slightly skeletonized. And there's no airflow benefit to the hangar like there would be on some subsequent carriers, where obviously you can start the skeletonization process much lower down and thus actually save a significant amount of weight by having the overall hull lower. And because I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize, this is why I chose this picture, you can see the forwardmost elevator down just adjacent to the island there. Just fractionally forward of that elevator, that's where the hangar stops. This is why I was talking about the fine lines of the ship, because essentially almost everything forward of that elevator is accommodation. Because that hull narrows so quickly and so finely, they considered it not worth putting more aircraft in there because you wouldn't get that many in, and, well, you needed somewhere to keep the people as well. So all you'd be doing would be introducing an annoying draft into the front face of some interior bulkheads, which were otherwise occupied by a bunch of people. So you might as well keep it that way. Whereas, I say, once you purpose build a carrier, there are substantial weight savings to a more substantial open bow. And obviously the hull can be redesigned such that it's a little bit more consistent amidships rather than there's very slim lines on the Lexingtons, which means your hangar can come further forward, crew accommodation can be further down, although there is still some crew accommodation forward on ships like Ranger, Yorktown, Enterprise, etc. But the savings are only really manifest when you are doing it right from the beginning. Although, with that said, even then, obviously the Essexes that got refitted went back to having enclosed bows. Snowstalker 36 asks, what were the modifications to a Wix-Clemson to turn it into an APD? And how well could it still fill in as a destroyer in a pinch? For the flush deckers, as you can see one here, the conversion process, the largest bits of it at least, involve the following. So half of the boiler rooms were removed. That caused the speed to drop, obviously, because you only had half the power plant. But along with removing all those boilers, you could also remove the trunking and the funnels, and that opened up a fair bit of space immediately aft of the bridge. So that large cavernous space was then turned into the troop transport section, so that's where all the troops would stay, most of their supplies would be, etc., etc. And then, as you can see, it's pretty obvious from this picture, where the torpedo launchers was completely changed as well. Torpedo launchers completely gone, along with most of the superstructure, and instead you get these heavy davits for these 4 assault craft or landing craft. And those are the major internal and external structural changes. And then armament was also completely changed. So most of the Wix and Clemson class obviously had anti-surface weaponry of various calibers, but with the conversion, as you can see right after, there's depth charge launchers. If they had them, they were kept. If they didn't have them, they were installed, along with depth charge rails. And then the original armament, which obviously included the torpedo launchers, was completely removed. And instead of your anti-surface weaponry, you would have a bunch of 20mm and 40mm guns and some 3-inch guns, 1, 2, or 3, depending on exactly which ship and exactly which time period. And obviously, if you only had one 3-inch gun, you might have more 20mm and 40mm. If you have 3, obviously, you're going to have somewhat less. And that's your basic APD conversion. And as you might guess from that, if you called them into action as destroyers, they're not going to perform particularly well. They still do have their sub-hunting capability, such as it is, but in a straight-up surface destroyer action, they have no torpedoes anymore, and even the ones that have 3-inch guns, well, 3-inch guns versus destroyers that can have 4, 4.5, 4.75, 5.1-inch weapons, and more of them, it's probably not going to end all that well, especially because, of course, with half the boilers gone, they're down to 25 knots, and most destroyers that they might run into are going to be well over 30. On the other hand, the ABDs generally were given fully comprehensive upgrades of electronic suites, so they might have SG surface search radar, for instance, which, at least at night, might allow you, if you absolutely had to sneak up on a destroyer and just pelt them with 3-inch and 40mm fire from point-blank range if you didn't get noticed on the way in. Brad in SoCal asks, due to current events, I'm curious about naval history in the Caspian Sea. It seems like one of the Great Lakes between the US and Canada. Obviously, those are important for trade and several naval battles over the period the channel covers. Is there any similar history for the Caspian Sea? Not really. You'd think there would be, given that at one end of it you have the Persians - Ottomans, etc., and at the other end of it you have the Russians, who, historically speaking, have not gotten along very well. However, believe it or not, the Caspian Sea wasn't actually significantly occupied on either coastline by either power until, relatively speaking, recently, within the last 400 or 500 years or so. Once that did happen, of course, there would inevitably be naval conflict. However, with that said, the Ottomans didn't really rate the Caspian Sea as a particularly high priority. So there's a clash or two in the very late 1600s. Then, although the Ottomans have control of it, they don't really do much with it. The Russians use it for moving troops around, but the Ottomans never really seem to build much of a fleet until the middle of the 1700s, when the Ottomans wake up to, well, maybe having our enemy have free troop transport all around this part of our border is not a good idea. They build a fleet. It gets then attacked and destroyed while it's under construction by the Russians, who obviously want to stop the Ottomans from stopping them. And then a few years later, there's a treaty where one of the treaty conditions put in by the Russians is, you will not build warships on the Caspian Sea, because we kind of like having control of it. And from then on, the Caspian Sea will see a few Russian warships floating around, but not that many. Eventually, you get to World War I, and there's a handful of, believe it or not, destroyers and submarines on the Caspian Sea for some reason. I'm not entirely sure who they're intending to fight, but there you go. And then the last major military action that I know of on the Caspian Sea is the one depicted here, the Battle of the Alexandrovsky Fort. And that is essentially when the British rock up and they join up with the White Russians. So this is during the Bolshevik Revolution immediately after World War I. And in true British style, they decide, it's an inland sea, therefore we shall have an inland navy, and the Royal Navy's Caspian Sea Flotilla is formed. As you might guess from this depiction, Britain isn't going to build entire warships up there, and it's rather difficult to get warships from the sea to the Caspian Sea, from the actual oceans there. So they commandeer a whole bunch of merchant ships and freighters and turn them into a small flotilla of auxiliary cruisers, along with some White Russian equivalents. And they go over to the Russian, or Soviet, I should say, naval base, and decide to have a bit of a fight. And although the Soviets have the submarines and the destroyers from the actual military flotilla, the Caspian Sea Flotilla is so large it actually heavily outguns the Russians. It wins the fight, blows up a bunch of stuff. It's rather helped by the fact they hit one of the Russian ships that explodes spectacularly, Soviet ships, I should say. And that explosion takes out a bunch of the other ships involved. So having essentially blown up or set on fire to everything in the vicinity and running a bit low on ammunition, the Caspian Sea Flotilla goes back to its home port. But obviously, as we know, eventually, overall, the Bolsheviks win the Soviet Revolution. So the Caspian Sea Flotilla is eventually surrendered. That's pretty much it, as far as I'm aware, for the martial history of the Caspian Sea. Richard Chu asks, during World War I and World War II, did different navies have a tradition of serving a special meal before they went into battle? And if so, what did those meals look like? Yes and no. So, as far as I'm aware, most navies didn't have a kind of, hey, this is a very special meal and we're going to serve precisely this before we go into battle. Mostly because you couldn't predict when you were going to go into battle with that level of accuracy. And, well, it would be a little bit of a giveaway as well. Plus, of course, everyone's on different watches. So, do you serve this meal to the people who are just coming on watch or about to go on watch, and then the guys already on watch and who are currently at rest don't get it. Because, if you're in, say, Operation Pedestal, or Operation Vigorous or Harpoon, and one of the Malta convoys, you're going into battle, but that battle's going to last days, essentially. You're going to be at action stations, off action stations, on and off all the time. Where do you start that? And when it comes to at sea engagements, cruiser versus cruiser, capital ship versus capital ship, again, you don't necessarily know that that's going to happen. You might, if you're lucky, be aware that you are heading for action, but even then, most of the time, you might not know exactly when you're going to encounter the enemy. The kind of situation with something like the final stand of Bismarck, where you know where Bismarck is, and you know that you are going to encounter them the next day, that's actually, relatively speaking, rare. So at that point, there's no real point in having here's our special battle meal, because, well, it's basically almost never going to be served. It's just going to be sitting in stores forever and a day. However, there were cases where, more generally, you might know that you were going to go into action that day, or you were at least likely to go into action that day. So obviously the final stand of Bismarck would be an example. The Battle of North Cape, they knew Scharnhorst was coming. Not exactly when she was going to show up, but they knew she was coming. Or if you were heading into somewhere like Okinawa or Iwo Jima, you knew that the kamikazes were going to start falling out of the sky sooner rather than later. And in those circumstances, most navies would try and serve a kind of sort of special meal. It wasn't a kind of, here is our fixed battle menu, like I said. It would be more a case of, okay, what is the biggest, heartiest, highest carb, most filling, most energy granting, long, slow burn, if you like, energy release meal that we can give people. So, in British terms, a massive fry-up. Eggs, bacon, sausages, bread, butter, that kind of stuff. And encourage everyone to, absolutely fill their plates, because it would give them a bunch of energy, and they might very well be at action stations for a very long time. If you go to action stations, and let's say you go to action stations at 9, after you've had this nice big breakfast, you might be stuck at action stations till the end of the day. You're not going to have a break to go and have lunch. So you need that big infusion of energy to keep you going. And once the ship is at action stations, you can't have things like the ovens and the grill going. So even if you were allowed off duty, then no one's going to have hot cooked food for the most part ready for you. And at that point, you would have additional food being served, but it would mostly be cold food, and if you're lucky, it would be brought up to you. Hot drinks another matter, because of course that can be done with just electricity. So, for example, again, because there's been so much written by survivors of the encounter, in the final battle with Bismarck, Rodney's crew had a good hearty breakfast, but then they were at action stations for hours and hours and hours, and people were bringing them sandwiches and flasks of tea and that kind of stuff to sustain them, but obviously it's not a full meal. And similarly in the US, I believe it's called midrats, which is essentially, if you're at action stations for a very long time, there will be a form of essentially grab-and-go food prepared in the galley, so that if you have 5 minutes, you can go down, grab something, and basically run away with it back to your station, and probably consume a bunch of it there if necessary. Andrew Dederer asks, the Dreadnought Revolution put a lot of ships on the road to obsolescence, but bad as it was for battleships, didn't it do worse by armoured cruisers? At Tsushima, they were considered battle line units. By the end of World War I, they were pretty much all going to the breakers, if they hadn't already been sent there or gotten themselves sunk. Was it just the big guns on the battleships and battlecruisers, or maybe turbines as well? Because post-Falklands, an armoured cruiser just seems to be an effective way to drown 1,000 men in one go, and it's become a ship in search for purpose. The new heavy cruisers post-war started at a third to half of battleship tonnage, and never really caught up. Yes and no. So World War I and the Dreadnought Revolution did put paid to the armoured cruiser in most places. I think an awful lot of it was down to two main things. Firstly, the battleship, the dreadnought battleship that is, and the battle cruiser opened up the idea of a unified main armament, whereas the vast majority of armoured cruisers tended to go with a very mixed armament, which was obviously now shown to be somewhat inferior. It's telling that most of the armoured cruisers that survive in some form of active role post-World War I are ones that have either a unified main battery or a closer to unified main battery than just a big gun forward and a big gun aft. However, it also depends very much on the navy in question. Because as you point out, with the advent of turbines, there were some turbine-powered armoured cruisers, but generally speaking, armoured cruisers were now either only fractionally faster, or in some cases the same speed or even slower than some battleships, and of course some nations had battle cruisers which were considerably faster and more powerful than the armoured cruiser. So the niche that the armoured cruiser filled relative to the pre-dreadnought, which was somewhat less armament, somewhat less armour, but faster, had basically gone. Also, thanks to their size and the sheer number of weapons they were very manpower intensive, and everyone was facing a drawdown in the post-World War I environment. So, if you can have 1,100, 1,200 men, and that's enough to man one of your newer dreadnought battleships, or you can have the same number of men, roughly speaking, manning at that point, 15 to 20-year-old armoured cruiser, well, it's much better to stick the men on the battleship. But World War I and the Dreadnought Revolution didn't cause the complete extinction of the armoured cruiser. In some navies, much like with pre-dreadnoughts, they did stick around. The weird thing is that unlike pre-dreadnoughts, which tended to stick around either in navies that couldn't afford anything newer or bigger, like, say, the Greeks with Kyklis and Lemnos, or with the Germans, who were forbidden from having anything bigger, the armoured cruiser actually hung around in some of the larger navies for a surprising amount of time. The French, for example, employed some of the Edgar Quinet class armoured cruisers, and the last one that actually had an active role as a foreign station flagship was still in active service in the early 1930s, and in theory, particularly the Edgar Quinets, which among armoured cruisers were one of the ones that came closest to a full unified main battery, on paper, while obviously considerably slower than what was then the new cruiser and then later heavy cruisers, she still massively outgunned most modern heavy cruisers and massively out-armoured them, which isn't exactly surprising, considering she was also considerably larger. Also, the US Navy hung on to a bunch of its armoured cruisers for a surprisingly long time, and there were periodic agitations to modernise and rearm them, mostly essentially foundering on the fact that no matter what you plausibly did to their machinery, you were not going to get them much past the mid-20s of knots, and that wasn't good enough in a navy that wanted 30-plus knots for all of its cruisers. Theoretically, you could possibly have done that by significantly altering the underwater lines with bow extensions and stuff like that, but that kind of cost wasn't seen as worth it. But also the simple fact of the matter was that for the US Navy, they just flat out didn't have that many cruisers in the early interwar period. They were building the Omahas, but those were scout cruisers, and it was only once you get things like the Pensacola's starting to be built that the US Navy actually has large cruisers, whereas other navies it might be facing off against, like the Japanese or the British, they already have a bunch of large and in many cases modern cruisers around, so something's better than nothing. The Tennessee class armoured cruisers, much as they might be obsolete in terms of speed and so forth, they were relatively well protected for the interwar period as cruisers, and they still could carry a fairly hefty armament until they could be replaced with something a bit more modern. But by sort of 1930-ish, the combination of their age and their cost to run, plus the increasing number of modern cruisers around, meant the final death knell of the armoured cruiser. Whiskey Delta Golf asks, was the fact that the ship completed significantly heavier than designed a significant factor in the failure of HMS Captain? She was obviously a flawed design, but if her builders had done a better job, would she at least have been able to remain afloat? So there is a little bit of debate, surprisingly enough, amongst naval historians when it comes to Captain. So there is a view that it wasn't just Captain's nature as an extremely overweight vessel that didn't help. It was also her masts. As you can see here from this photo of her, she had very heavily built tripod masts, and the theory goes that when the storm that eventually sank her struck, it's noted that some other ships, well as just having their sails furled, some of the ones that had their sails out, the sails blew out, and therefore obviously it helped keep them upright, whereas with Captain, her masts and rigging were so strong that the theory runs that they would actually hold the sails in place, and then of course as the wind picks up, the sails just push the ship over, which doesn't help. However, it is known from the examinations that were done even before she sank, or the calculations done due to examinations of her design, that the Navy realised pretty much at the last minute, hey, this ship is, because of its being built overweight, sitting much lower in the water than it should and ridiculously unstable. And they were actually trying to get word of this out to the fleet at the time that Captain was lost. And this certainly does seem to be supported by the accounts of the last few days of Captain at sea, because she did have an absolutely awful roll. She was a very unstable gun platform. And when officers went aboard her the day before she sank, they noted that, one, she was sitting very low in the water, and two, she was rolling all the time. So the weight, obviously, making her sit lower in the water in the first place, because bear in mind the turret deck is kind of, that's her freeboard, but also where that weight was actually placed also helped make her unstable as well as sitting low in the water. And I think, she probably would have gone down just because of that at some point sooner or later. In some ways, she's suffering similar issues to USS Monitor, although she still rides higher in the water than Monitor, but is more unstable. But certainly I can leave room for the tripod masts potentially being a contributing factor, because, well, they may have either pushed her over past the point of no return when maybe without them she wouldn't have, or possibly they just pushed her over somewhat sooner. And so I think there's probably both didn't help. Reva's Rambling Recess asks, if the French had not attempted the somewhat dead end of the Jean Ecole and had instead focused on maintaining proper capital ship construction, how much would have maintaining the typical progression of shipyard expansion and capital ship expertise have helped them later on? It certainly seems that it could have helped them with the floating hotels, but would it still have made much of a difference over time through to World War II? Or is there a breakpoint where their distraction stops mattering? I think there's two sides to that particular equation, because yes, at some point it would stop mattering. So for example, once you've built the Corbeils and Bretagnes and you're thinking about building the Normandies, well, at that point you have had to upgrade your infrastructure just to accommodate the Corbeils and Bretagnes, because they are bigger than your pre-dreadnoughts. And then they, well, choose not to - can't, because France is at the time of building the Normandies, obviously the involvement in the First World War is kind of a distraction, and then with the Lyons, the slight bankruptcy resulting from World War I is a bit of a problem as well. However, you can also make an argument that perhaps they wouldn't be in that position in the first place had they continued with the more typical progression of shipyard expansion that you mentioned, because you end up in almost a vicious cycle of there aren't many capital ship orders, therefore the shipyards, A, don't have as much money available, because capital ship projects tend to be fairly profitable and long-term, as opposed to smaller margins on things like also done very quickly and leave you and your men looking for work much faster. But and obviously the design expertise to actually build capital ships that aren't horrible abominations like poor old Carnot here. And what it would mean is if you had a continuous scheme of significant capital ship building, the shipyards both have more money and more incentive to look at expanding their infrastructure, because if they can see what the trend of everyone else's ships are, and they can see what the trend of French ships are, it's fairly obvious to then extrapolate, well, if the British have now built this really big ship, we are probably going to get an order for that another really big ship of equivalent force, and with various private as well as national shipyards in France at the time, and a bit more money because they've been building a decent stream of large ships already, then there's more incentive for some of those private yards to go, you know what, we're going to invest in building bigger slipways and bigger dry docks, because, hey, if there's, let's say for sake of argument, half a dozen major building companies in France, we know, we can see in 6 months, a year, 2 years, there's going to be contracts for much bigger vessels. If we start upgrading our infrastructure now, we can then turn around to the French government and say, well, look, we are the cheaper option because we can start construction immediately because we have the facilities. And also, we've paid for most of that expansion ourselves, so it's not going to cost you as much to order from us as it would from somebody else. Now, of course, they would make some of their money back as well. So whereas an unupgraded yard would have to say, well, I don't know, let's say, random example, we're going to charge you 40 million francs for the ship and 20 million to expand the infrastructure to accommodate the new ship. The pre-upgraded shipyard will probably go, yeah, well, we can just charge you 50 million francs. So it's 10 million francs cheaper. The ship is 10 million more expensive, and obviously that 10 million goes into their pockets to somewhat or perhaps wholly offset the cost of the infrastructure expansion that they've done, which is already done and dusted. And you cycle that through, obviously, the late ironclad period, and then going into the pre-dreadnought period, and then into the dreadnought period. And the shipyards are in a much stronger position to keep expanding and perhaps make a significant investment in really large expansion, because especially when battle cruisers come along for very long vessels, they might be prompted to do more infrastructure upgrades than just, say, in the interwar period, the Normandy dockyard. And if you've got a bigger, stronger shipbuilding industry through the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, then it's going to hopefully remain bigger with contracts able to build bigger and better designs, and thus, if they're able to build bigger and better designs and also more efficiently, it's more likely that at least prior to the end of World War I, you might get export orders. France did get some, but not as many as they perhaps could have done. And then even in the interwar period, building merchant ships and ocean liners and stuff to replace the stuff lost in World War I is much easier when you can say, hey, look, we can build you a new, really big, brand new, really cool ocean liner or mixed service vessel or freighter or whatever. Slow Pixie asks, being a Kriegsmarine aficionado, I've always had a soft spot for the Deutschland and Hipper class, but despite having read a fair amount of sources, some of which I've taken from your book recommendation series, I still find their armour layout confusing due to all the contradicting information. Could you give a brief overview of their armour schemes and what you think are the accurate thicknesses of their plates, as well as their degree of protection against other 6 and 8 inch guns of the Second World War? Well, unfortunately, it is quite confusing to keep track of everything, in part because especially the Deutschlands and to a lesser extent the Hippers were almost constantly evolving designs from ship to ship. So Deutschland-Lutzow, Admiral Scheer and Admiral Graf Spee actually have remarkably different armour values when you look at the total armour scheme for each vessel. With Hipper, Blücher and Prince Eugen, it's slightly more sane, although, as I've covered many times when talking about the Hippers, those things are constantly growing to the point that obviously there are some changes even in their protection scheme, particularly in layout. And of course, because they're German, they're following the distributed armour scheme, which means that unlike British or American ships where you can say the armour belt is this thick and maybe it tapers to this much in certain areas. With the German scheme, it's like, well, it's this thick here, and it's this thick here, and it tapers down to this bit here, but over here it tapers to a different section, and over the bow it's this thick, and at the stern it's this thick, but also, in this particular ship in the stern, it thins even further to this, and the armour deck here is this thick, but over here it's that thick, and then there's the second armour deck, and that has a different section. It's just like, stop. It's like they were trying to confuse people when they were setting out these armor thicknesses. Anyway, I think the full scope of the armor scheme, especially for the Deutschlands, because there's so many different combinations of armor in those three ships, is probably worth a video in and of itself. But broadly speaking, if you want to assume for a generic Hipper or a generic Deutschland an 80mm thickness of armor, which equates to about 3.1 inches, is roughly what you could expect to find on the belt of the generic Deutschland or Hipper. As I say, especially with the Deutschlands, that is going to vary somewhat. The Hippers, at least the belt thickness stays roughly what it should be. Now, with that as a generic rule of thumb in mind, it means if you're going up against a British county class cruiser, for example, then assuming that you're roughly broadside rather than any kind of funky angle, you essentially don't have any actual protection against incoming British shells as a Deutschland or a Hipper, because up to about 22,000 yards, a British 8-inch shell from a county will quite happily punch through your belt armour, and beyond that it'll happily punch through your deck armour. You've got somewhat better protection against 6-inch gunfire, as indeed Graf Spee, the most heavily protected of the Deutschlands, proved at the Battle of River Plate. A ship with 6-inch guns would have to get to about 10 to 12,000 yards to get through your belt armour, and would have to be hitting at well over 22,000 yards to get through your deck armour. So you've actually, in your most comfortable engagement range, actually got a fair degree of protection against incoming 6-inch gunfire. Against American guns, it's pretty much the same story. So against the American 8-inch, much like the British 8-inch, you don't have protection broadside to broadside. You're just going to take the hits. Against the American 6-inch guns, though, it is a different story. Some American 6-inch guns with certain shells are going to have approximately the same lethal range as the British, so about 10 to 12,000 yards. But the latest and greatest in American 6-inch shells and guns, as found in the middle of World War II on, say, something like a Brooklyn, as I say, with the latest and greatest shells, or probably more accurately a Cleveland, I would say, that actually extends, again, assuming broadside, to about 16,000 yards, the point where the shell can penetrate your 80mm plating. So that would give you a bit more point. I mean, you still do have a kind of 6,000-ish yard zone of immunity even against those 6-inch shells, at least for your primary armour sections. But it is obviously a narrower window than against, say, a Town class or a Leander. Fall to Earth asks several questions. In the Battle of Samar, what colour die packs did Chikuma's shells have? When Roberts was engaged with her, what other Japanese ships were firing at her? And at about 8:40 a.m, had Chikuma or Roberts taken any notable damage? As best I can tell, it seems that the Japanese cruiser squadrons present were not using die packs. Pretty much, there's plenty of references to the die packs used on various capital ships, but unless I've missed something major, I can't find any specific reference to the Japanese cruisers having die packs, so it would have just been standard white splashes. As far as for what other ships Roberts was engaged with, or were at least shooting at her, I mean, it varies over time during her exchange with Chikuma, but obviously Roberts' crew report there were multiple different colours of shell splash coming up and above her, and she's traditionally credited, as far as the shells that kill her, to being targeted by Congo. So there would have been multiple Japanese shells. Of course, you can go through the survivors' accounts and match up the shell colours they report with the shell colours known to be used by the various Japanese capital ships present. But then you've also got the colourless shell splashes, the generic water ones, and that could be Chikuma, it could be other cruisers, it could even be, technically speaking, Yamato, although that's very unlikely. As far as by 8:40, what damage had they taken? Well, Roberts had previously taken a shell hit, at least one shell hit. In her action report, it says that a stray enemy shell hit the radio antenna, which in falling fell across the torpedo tubes and dislodged the speed setting wrench. Consequently, torpedoes had to be fired at intermediate speed, so basically a portion of her mast was shot off. However, her action report credits her with receiving her first proper hit, i.e. someone was actually aiming at her, at 8:51, when a hole punches in below the waterline at number 1 lower handling room. So at 8:40 it would just be the fallen mast over the torpedo tubes. But obviously, Chickamauer being sunk, it's a bit more difficult to put things together. However, it is known that by 8:40, given that she'd been under fire from Roberts for about half an hour at that point, she would have taken quite a few 5-inch hits, and by that point, Roberts was down to her star shells. So, yeah, there'd be a number of different hits, including the star shells bursting aboard. Although, of course, with Roberts being under direct fire from multiple ships, the shell splashes around her would be a little bit technicolor. We have found the problem and it isn't ours asks, what are your favourite naval expressions that have made the jump into mainstream English? And are there any phrases in the maritime vernacular that you think us landlubbers are missing out on? Well, my two favourite that probably come up in everyday use are all hands on deck and learning the ropes, because they're used very, very commonly, and of course, all hands on deck. That's because, there's about to be a massive storm, or we were about to go into action, and learning the ropes, the origin of it is obviously teaching people the various ropes in the ship's rigging, but nowadays it's taking someone from basic to hopefully competent in what they're doing their task for. There are some phrases and terms which I think people miss out on. I mean, personally, I find myself using ships' reference points a lot in everyday language, which sometimes people find confusing, because I'll more often refer to the fore or aft end, or the amidships portion of something, or port or starboard more though, so then I'd say front, back, left, right, in the middle. But in other terms, it's actually a very difficult question for me to answer, because shockingly enough, a reasonable number of the people I know actually are also interested in naval history, and as a result, from the wider group of people I know, other people who may not necessarily know or be that interested in naval history also manage to pick up on the general gist of things, because something like all ahead full, or raising steam, or furling sails, stuff like that, I'll find myself using them occasionally to describe actions that either I want to do or am doing, and people kind of mostly understand what on earth I'm on about, but I don't know how much that would translate into the general public. Andre de Coult asks, I remember from the book Most Secret War by R.V. Jones that they did a disinformation campaign when the H-2S airborne radar was introduced, making the Germans think the British had developed an infrared detector that could see a U-boat surfaced as black against a dark grey of a background sea. The Germans then developed a paint for their submarines that made them look at a grey similar level to the sea. It lasted a good number of months before they got it about H-2S and deployed detectors, and the U-boat started diving whenever H-2S aircraft was closing. Could you please give us some more details? Yep, so a slightly adapted H-2S radar was adopted by Coastal Command as ASV Mark III, or Air to Surface Radar Mark III. And it was essentially just H-2S, but with a slightly different aerial, accounting for the fact, as you can see here, that when searching, Coastal Command aircraft tended to fly at a slightly lower altitude than Bomber Command aircraft did over Germany. But in another book that he wrote, The Wizard War, British Scientific Intelligence, 1939 to 1945, R.V. Jones, who worked quite heavily in infrared, actually goes and tells us a fair bit more detail. So I'm going to quote verbatim from there. And so he's initially talking about how H-2S is going to be adopted as ASV-3, and they wanted, the Naval Intelligence Division asked him to mislead the Germans about how they were finding the U-boats. He said, there was an additional urgency to this request because we had another way of finding U-boats which was even more important than H-2S, at least as regards to their general location. And this was the German naval Enigma signals, but which by a further feat Bletchley had managed to decipher. And then he says, the basis of the deception was that we should give the impression that we were finding the U-boats not by radar or by their Enigma signals, but by infrared. I therefore provided a series of clues, aided once again by George. This is one of the German double agents, who was the vector for transmitting all this back to Germany. And this appears to have been successful, for not only were the Germans very slow in realizing we were using centimetric radar against them at sea, long after they found it in our crash bombers, but they also developed a most ingenious paint for their U-boats to camouflage them against infrared as well as against visible light. If a normal grey-painted ship, which is thus camouflaged well against a typically grey sea, is viewed by infrared, it still looks grey, but the sea looks blackish, because it's colder. They therefore had to make a paint which looked grey to the human eye, but blackish to an infrared viewer. They achieved this by putting a black undercoat on the U-boats, and covering it by a varnish which contained a suspension of powdered glass in sufficient quantities to give a grey effect when viewed by a human eye. The glass and the varnish were, however, so chosen that their refractive indices were identical to the infrared, which went through the mixture and was absorbed in the black undercoat. It was a clever idea, and I much admired the German physicist who thought of it. He then goes on to describe the 6-month delay between introducing ASV Mark III and U-boats beginning to dive on the approach of an equipped aircraft, and he points out that in the 1951, obviously before Bletchley Park was unclassified, a professor at MIT said, "How this 6-month delay occurred is one of the mysteries of the war. It can perhaps be explained only by the criminal lack of liaison between the German naval and air technical staffs." And he says, well, an alternative explanation may obviously lie in the infrared hoax. Although he does also comment that another hoax may have also played a part, as a British prisoner of war under interrogation ingeniously told the Germans that our aircraft were homing onto them by some kind of radiation that was coming out of the METOX receivers, which were used by U-boats to detect the approach of our original ASV-equipped aircraft. It was a complete fabrication, but when the Germans investigated, they found there was actually radiation coming out of the METOX receiver, and they went to some trouble to suppress it, without, of course, any success in reducing their U-boat losses. When the Germans finally realised we were using radar after all, they fortunately blamed it for all their U-boat sinkings. Dönitz even going so far as to say that this one invention had changed the balance in the Battle of the Atlantic, and our Enigma feat remained secure. Matt Kidd asks, were any twin-engine carrier aircraft seriously considered during World War II? Yes, definitely, although to what degree of seriousness depends on the Navy and the time period. So, for example, at one point there was a proposal for a navalised version of the P-38 Lightning with folding wings, but the US Navy didn't particularly like the Lightning, didn't particularly like inline liquid-cooled engines, and didn't particularly like anything about the project. So, although it was a serious proposal, it didn't really get anywhere with the US Navy. Or more seriously, however, of course, the F-7F Tiger Cat was supposed to be a carrier-based fighter aircraft. It didn't quite work out that way in the end because, well, its performance didn't quite add up, but the US Navy did definitely want it, right up until it turned out it didn't quite work how they wanted it to do. And as you can see here, the Fleet Air Arm was quite enthused with the idea of a Sea Mosquito, and the Sea Mosquito actually made its first successful landing aboard a carrier in March 1944. It just, for various reasons, took well over a year for them to take that idea and turn it into a batch production run of full production Sea Mosquitoes, which meant that they and their successor, the Sea Hornet, only ever went to sea after the war was actually over. But if they'd either had the idea sooner or been a bit quicker about production, then you could have seen Sea Mosquitoes in the latter stages of the Pacific campaign. And I think it's quite telling that the majority of twin-engined ideas for carrier aircraft tend to be when those carriers are operating in the Pacific with obviously the requisite long-range requirements, because then at that point being able to take a good heavy load a long distance, which is something a twin-engine aircraft could do a little bit better, becomes a lot more important than if you're operating in and around Europe, where the ranges are still important but not necessarily quite as important, because Europe just tends to be kind of there. Pre-war, of course, the French also experimented with twin-engine carrier aircraft operating on Béarn, but not much seems to have come of that. Reichspear Minister asks, with World War II, we do see the importance of replenishment-supply-support ships to be able to fight a longer distance from home. But where did this journey start, and what are important milestones in their history until Pearl Harbour? Well, logistic ships have always been important to varying degrees, but in the age of sail, they for a long time were seen as of lesser importance, simply because, of course, a sail vessel didn't have to worry about fuel, it only had to worry about food and water, and to a certain extent food, could be had almost anywhere that you could find a spring and maybe some stuff to hunt, or, if you were more fortunate, a port to pull into. So ships could be very self-sustaining over very long periods of time, hence why ships like Magellan's ship and the Golden Hind were able to do round-the-world voyages, even though they carried nowhere near enough food and water and other supplies to actually do that voyage. They would just stop off along the way. However, once you required ships to start remaining at a specific location that didn't really allow them to just break off whenever they needed to restock food and water, etc., then logistics start to become far more acute, and therefore replenishment ships start to become needed considerably more so. So an important milestone in this respect would be the mid-1700s, because there had been issues about bringing supplies out to the Armada and so forth, but this was very much one-off, unique situations. Whereas in the mid-1700s, you have Admiral Hawke developing the system of blockade, because the British had been able to blockade French harbours like Brest before, but that blockade could either last until the fleet ran out of supplies and had to go home, at which point the French could then come out and do what they wanted, or it would be incredibly expensive to maintain the blockade, because a ship would, or a fleet would run until its supplies ran low, and then you'd have to have an entire other fleet gearing up and ready to go while that first fleet was on blockade. Then the second fleet would come out, swap over, the first fleet would go home, and then you'd have to have a third fleet gearing up ready to go to replace the second fleet, because the first one would need to rest and refit, and so on and so forth. So if you wanted to keep, say, 15 ships off of Brest, that meant you needed at least 45 ships of the line, and possibly more, to account for damage and sickness and all sorts of other things. So maybe about 50 ships just constantly to maintain that blockade. And, well, that wasn't really sustainable. Whereas Admiral Hawke turned around and said, well, if we have a specific system where supply ships and occasionally warships coming out on duty bring more supplies with them, and they head out and they resupply the ships on blockade in a consistent cycle, then yeah, okay, if we want 15 ships off the coast, we might need to have 20 to 25 ships overall, because we'll occasionally have to cycle them out as disease and wear and tear and just the need for rest take their toll. But we've immediately halved our problem, and the only cost of not having to maintain 25 active ships of the line is the cost of occasionally stocking up one of the ships we send out, or paying for the commission of a merchant ship or two to, say, take out some bulk supplies. So that was a very important milestone. Then, of course, things regress slightly once you get to the age of steam, because now ships have a limited range once they lose their sails, because you now can't just straight up run out of fuel. So suddenly you need logistical vessels to make sure that, for example, coal is scattered all around the world at various ports that you can then access. So replenishment and supply ships become very much a matter of essentially pre-stocking various ports, so ships sail around, and then as they start to run low on fuel, which is usually the thing they'll start to run out of first, then they can drop in, refuel, and then obviously resupply food, water, and all the other bits and pieces that they want to resupply with. And then people start experimenting with the idea of refueling at sea, or at least refueling not in a port. So for recoaling, they do start to develop in the pre-World War I and World War I periods systems where ships can meet colliers in sheltered bays to transfer coal across. With the advent of oil, theoretically, this becomes slightly easier, because you don't need to manhandle barrels of oil one at a time. You can do it with a hose. And then that leads to the development of resupply at sea, because, of course, you can just pop up next to an oil tanker in a harbour the same way that you could with a coal ship. But then you think about, but if we can do it on the open ocean, so you have the fore and aft method, and then various nations, including particularly the US, but also Japan to an extent, pioneer the side-by-side method, which is even more efficient. And those techniques are known about prior to Pearl Harbor. They just haven't been implemented on a massively wide scale with a lot of practice just yet. Eric Van Dooting asks, what do you believe is the worst outcome the US could have accepted at Midway and still have been willing to go forward with the Guadalcanal campaign without a significant delay in the timeline? I think probably your two worst cases would have been either if Japanese strikes had also damaged Enterprise and Hornet, because if you look at look at how quickly they patch up Yorktown when they need to, and then you look at Enterprise and Hornet and Midway relative to the time period when they needed off Guadalcanal. And I think if Enterprise and Hornet had maybe taken a handful of bomb hits apiece, so you end the Battle of Midway with the Japanese having lost all 4 of their fleet carriers, the Americans having lost 1 and had 2 damaged, that would be a workable situation, because the US would just go, okay, well, we'll haul them back in, we'll spend a few weeks repairing them, and then we'll put them back out on duty, assuming the damage isn't too bad. The absolute worst outcome would probably be for 1 additional carrier to be lost. So the US trades 2 of their carriers for 4 of the enemy's. That leaves you with 1 Yorktown-class carrier left. Obviously, Wasp is coming in. Eventually, Saratoga is going to be repaired. In those circumstances, they know that the Japanese have Shikaku and Zuikaku plus a few other smaller carriers available. I think as long as they have 2 fleet carriers, so in this case that being, let's say, Enterprise and Wasp, and they know that Saratoga's in the offing, they might then bring in Ranger to act, at least, I mean, they have concerns obviously about her speed and survivability, but they might bring her in to act as a kind of a backstop distant support. They might just about go with Guadalcanal on that basis, because then they can have 3, maybe 4 carriers around. But that would be, I think, the absolute worst case that they would accept. Stuart Cork asks, going back to your Mikasa visit, I was thinking about the 3-inch gun gallery, and I'm wondering, did the casement guns on dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts have similarly open spaces, or were they self-contained so that 1 hit wouldn't take out an entire battery with splinters? Also, were they fed by just 1 lift from the magazine, or were they completely self-contained with their own dedicated machinery? What sort of redundancy was there on Dreadnought-era casements to prevent 1 hit affecting multiple casements, or was this why Treaty-era capital ships had turreted secondary armament? It depends on the grade of gun. So obviously here this is Mikasa's 3-inch gun deck, and yeah, well, there would be a little bit of screening between them, but it would be very, very minor, essentially not particularly useful against anything more than the smallest splinters and the occasional shockwave. The 6-inch casements, of course, are somewhat better protected and a bit more isolated, but generally speaking, one of the big risks of casement batteries was that a lot of them tended to just be on a long open gallery deck, not quite as open as this, but still internally open, or with very minimal screening, maybe if you're lucky, a very thin bulkhead. Nothing armoured, just enough to, again, maybe stop the smallest of splinters and flash. But that was really about it. It was a major problem with casement decks, but that feeds into your other question about the ammunition feeds. Most casement batteries, some would be fed with just a single ammo lift on either side. More often there'd be at least 2. Because, well, if you're fishing up a 6-inch shell at the aft end of the ship, you don't want to have to go running the whole length of the casement battery just to get it to the relevant gun. They would, of course, have ready-use ammunition lockers as well, but usually most extensive casement batteries would have at least 2 ammo lifts, 1 fore and 1 aft. And then the ammo would be in some way, whether it be by runners, trolleys, whatever, farmed out along the length of the casements, as I say, with ready-use ammunition there, so to allow for a high rate of fire in bursts. And then obviously during lulls in firing, you'd be restocking the ready-use lockers as well. And to stop a hit on one casement affecting multiple casements, the basic rule was, well, the casements themselves would have armour plating, armoured gun shields, so hopefully at least smaller caliber fire wouldn't get through, and if a big shell came in, it was generally held that, well, there wasn't a huge amount you could do about it, other than, again, maybe those minimal screens or thin bulkheads might limit you to losing 1, 2, 3 casement guns just from the blast radius rather than everything. John Plate asks, I was rewatching your video about the training carriers on the Great Lakes. Did the Japanese and the British have a similar setup where a body of water was available that wasn't on the front lines? And did the British think, oh, we've got access to Canada, and maybe try something similar? For the Japanese, the Sea of Japan, which is the bit of water that's to the west of Japan between it and the mainland Asia, is, or was certainly at that point, seen as a mostly secure area for them. And then, of course, you also have the inland sea between 3 of the Japanese home islands. Although that's a much smaller body of water, both of those were seen as relatively secure because they were relatively confined. There were only a few accesses to them, and those could be patrolled. So certainly early on that was mostly true, although as the war progressed, various US submarines and later obviously carrier aircraft and so forth would access those areas and bring any training activities to a rather dramatic halt. For the Royal Navy, there were some areas of ocean in proximity to Britain that were seen as more secure. So, for example, off the western coast of Scotland, there wasn't a huge amount of German U-boat activity, largely on the basis of the fact there wasn't a huge amount of merchant shipping there. So why would there be there? And so that area was used quite a lot for Royal Navy training. Ironically enough, quite a lot of anti-submarine Royal Navy training. But in terms of specifically carrier pilot training, generally the British would train their carrier pilots on land for a good portion of time and then transition to carriers like Argus or whatever operating in secure-ish patches of ocean. So yeah, they did train pilots in Canada, certainly. But there wasn't a kind of, this is absolutely definitively a secure body of water where you could do extensive carrier training the way that the US had the Great Lakes. It was more of, this is a fairly secure body of water, but we still have to keep up anti-sub patrols and keep on the alert. Sebastian asks, I heard a story about the difference between closing watertight doors. Allegedly, the Japanese had to physically bolt their doors closed with bolts and a wrench, while the US Navy and Royal Navy could easily turn a wheel to rotate the radial dogs, thus creating a seal. Is this true? I can't see any particular reason why that would be true, bearing in mind that dogged hatches and so forth were a known and well-established technology in the 19th century, and the Japanese bought a bunch of ships from Britain, which obviously used dogged hatches all the time, so they would have had easy access to this relatively basic technology. I can't think why or any reason that they would then change to a much inferior, oh, here's a wrench and a bolt, very, very slowly close and seal this particular hatch. Now, with that said, there were some naval hatches that could be further sealed using a bolt and a wrench, but the basic dogged hatch, whether that be the more common type where you have to manually secure each dog, or the slightly more complicated type with the spinny wheel in the middle, they're just pretty much generic technologies by World War I, World War II. I mean, I'd say I've been aboard Mikasa and she has dogged hatches, but then at the same time, Mikasa's been so heavily refitted since she first entered service that that's not necessarily a fair comparison. David Pierce asks, why did Japan go with a unified design for the 4 Congos instead of building them 1 or 2 at a time to progressively better designs, like the UK was doing? Were they just in a hurry, or did the latter 2 ships have improvements and just weren't different enough to be made particularly distinct? It comes down to fundamentally the approach to building a fleet, which was very different in Britain and Japan. So Britain had started off, obviously, building batch production battle cruisers. They built 3 Invincibles, then they built 3 Indefatigables. So they had a core of battle cruisers, but for the British, the battle cruiser, as I've discussed in the What is a Battle Cruiser video, was essentially an ancillary vessel. It had a role helping the battle line out, if needed, but it was essentially seen as a form of cruiser. And the main thing for the British was building a really big battle line. So when they're building a really big battle line, you build battleships in big batches, 4, 5, 6, 8 was the aim for the Revenge class originally. But with the battle cruisers, well, we've already got 6, so we might as well build, the idea was, because of their expense, to build a class of battleships and a battle cruiser, or maybe 2 each year. And that's why you kind of get these iterative designs going from Lion and Princess Royal to Queen Mary to Tiger. Whereas the Japanese have a smaller budget and a very different fleet idea. So for the British, they're having a massive fleet of battleships and some battle cruisers acting, as we said, as this ancillary force. For the Japanese, they initially were going to have a 50-50 split of pre-dreadnoughts and armoured cruisers. Now they're going to have a 50-50 split of dreadnoughts and battle cruisers. And therefore, because they also have a limited budget, it makes far more sense to them to come up with a really nice, powerful design of battle cruiser, like, say, the Congos for their time period, and then go, okay, we've built, in the Japanese case, they've built the Kawachis at that point, so they're going to go, okay, well, if we want four battle cruisers, or we want to follow our 8-8 plan, well, we need 4 battle cruisers now, and maybe 4 later on, so we're going to order 4 battle cruisers, build them, then we could go on and build 4 battleships, which would be the Fusos and the Iseis, and then the idea was to essentially move on and then do more battle cruisers, more battleships, because you lay them down all at the same time, build them all at roughly the same time, that's what you can afford. The alternative would be to, like you said, if they do them as the British do, almost a series of one-offs, by the time you get to 13.5-inch ships, you're constantly having to spend money designing new variants, which adds to the cost, as opposed to just going, this, quickly build lots of them. Able34 Bravo asks, could you do a comparison of a typical Admiral staff in the Age of Sail to an Admiral staff in the World War II period? I'm sure covering this in depth would require several videos, so a generalised overview would be great. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as a typical Admiral staff in the World War II period. Admiral Lee, for instance, was famous for having very minimal staff. Some other admirals would show up with 40, 50 people. Theoretically, both Admiral Lee and those admirals are both admirals. They both have similar command responsibilities. And yet one of them was able to do it with single-digit staff. The other one basically brought half the crew of a small destroyer with them. This example, which I use quite often, this is Admiral Sir Cyprian Bridge. He's Commander-in-Chief of the China Station in 1902 in this photo. And as you can see, he has a grand total staff of 6. So, yeah. In the Age of Sail, however, your Admiral staff would typically include a flag captain, a secretary, or 2, depending on how busy you were and how high-ranking you were, and someone to do signals. That's technically all you needed as a minimum. You could, of course, have more than one signals officer, both for redundancy in case one of them got killed or got ill, or if you were going to be sending in a lot of signals. As I said, you might have 1 secretary or 2. You might have what's called a captain of the fleet, who's essentially the chief of staff. He'd help the admiral with planning if that was felt necessary. And then if the secretary or secretaries were overwhelmed, particularly if you were a very senior admiral, then you might have some clerks assisting the secretaries, and you'd also obviously have stewards and personal servants, which you wouldn't tend to have strictly as part of the admiral's staff a lot of the time in World War II, because the stewards at that point would generally be part of the ship. Although you might have a favoured cook or steward that you'd bring with you because you particularly like the way he does things. And basically all of those roles would translate across to World War II, but you would also then have to have, as well as a flag lieutenant or lieutenant, depending on which navy you're in, you might have to have more than one of those. You might also have to have somebody who's skilled at radio, people who are good at cryptography, both decryption and encryption, an intelligence officer if you're on a carrier, maybe somebody with carrier experience. If you're an admiral who's mostly been on carriers and you're on a battleship, someone with battleship experience. And then you might have multiples of any one of those and the previous roles to try and take the workload down a little bit. And once you get past a certain size, you also then end up with ancillary supporting roles for the staff who are supporting you. So it kind of tends to balloon a bit. Dennis from Houston asks, do you think the Germans during World War II would have been better off in regards to their Panzer ship if they'd given them a steam plant that could run off Bunker C instead of their somewhat temperamental diesel plants? What would you have done if the Germans had told you to build it, given the historical limitations of the time? The Panzer ship, when they're looking at, we're long-distance commerce raiders, they really do put you in a bit of a sticky situation, because if you go with all diesel, which is obviously what the Germans historically did, that gives you ridiculous range, but because of the lower power density of diesels at the time, it also gives you a lower speed, which means that you can now be caught by groups of cruisers, as indeed Graf Spee was. The flip side is, if you have a more regular steam plant, then it's a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser design. You could, in theory, get the thing up to similar speeds to other heavy cruisers, which gives you more ability to disengage from them, but of course also means you lose an awful lot of operational range, which makes you perhaps less good as a commerce raider. The flip side, of course, is that as long as you come across something that's oil-fired, perhaps you could design some kind of specialist extraction equipment that would allow you to essentially siphon off fuel oil from ships that you captured, albeit at this point in time, while there are a fair number of merchant ships running on oil, there are also still quite a lot running on coal, so which obviously is no good to you. The flip side of that, of course, is that diesel, you either need to purify it, and there's limited stocks of it, despite obviously not necessarily needing to refuel quite as often. So I don't think that having a steam plant would be just a straight up advantage, because as I said, it would make you a more combat effective vessel, but from the point of view specifically of a merchant raider, that massive lack of range could present a significant problem compared to the diesels. I think if you were going to go with the optimal value, then you might actually resurrect a concept the Germans trialled in the First World War with Prince Regent Leopold, although they didn't quite manage to finish the entire plant in time, and that would be to have the central propulsion system a diesel to give you long distance, lower speed, extreme range, and then have your outer props running on steam turbines, because that would then give you the speed, and that might present the best of both worlds. Now, yes, of course, that would mean two different machinery systems, potentially two different fuel sources aboard, but I think that's the best way of squaring the particular circle of trying to get both long distance and high speed, which you can't do with one or the other on their own. JEC asks, recent events and your series on anti-slavery patrols bring this to the front of my mind. How exactly does US prize law work in the 20th century, over the period the channel covers, and does it differ from the 18th and 19th centuries? I could only find some oblique references to the actions of Captain Gallery and how U-505 became a museum, but surely there were other blockades and measures taken where this came up. And could you possibly expound on how this differs from similar British law? So the US prize money system did differ somewhat from the British system. Initially, the US prize system said that if you had to sink an enemy vessel for whatever reason, either directly in combat or with something like, say, guerrilla, you had to scuttle it afterwards, so you didn't have a ship to claim prize money from, you would instead receive a fixed amount of money which was set against the number of crew on the enemy ship at the start of the combat. So this was, in 1800, this was set at $20. So if there were 100 men on board the ship that you targeted, then your ship, the US ship, would receive $2,000 to be split among the crew, the same rate at the same rate as prize money if you had captured it. So the ratios of prize money, which were encapsulated into law, were that if you attacked and captured a vessel of equal or inferior force, then you got half the proceeds of the sale of the vessel. If you attacked and captured a vessel of superior force, you got everything for the crew. And then from that, whether that was 50% or 100% of everything, that amount was then divided up with 10% going to the captain, and 5% going to the Commodore. If the ship was operating alone, then the captain got that 5%, so he got 15%. The senior officers, so lieutenants and so forth, got another 10%. The senior petty officers, or NCOs, got a further 10%, and there were some adjustments depending on what kind of Marines were on board. Then the lower ranking officers, so the midshipmen and so forth, got 17.5%. The lower level petty officers got 12.5%, and the remaining 35% was split across the rest of the crew. In 1864, that system was revised, so there were a few small changes, because now there were flag officers, potentially for division commanders and fleet captains. They all got small percentages, but once those very senior officers, and of course the captain, had taken their shares, then you'd have the bulk of the prize money left over, and now that was divided among everybody else in the crew in proportion to your rate of pay. So it wasn't a case of, well, there's this pool of prize money and this group of officers or men get this. It was literally just a case of however many people there are and what's your rate of pay. So if you are, say, the ship's second officer and your rate of pay is, I don't know, 5 times the rate of pay of a regular enlisted sailor, then you would get whatever the sailor got multiplied by 5. And the money that you got for sinking an enemy ship was also increased because, of course, inflation. The US then abolished prize money in the immediate aftermath of the Spanish-American War, although there was one final award of money in the post-World War II period, but that was ruled as salvage rather than prize money. Jorg 2 Speculative Revolution asks, in 1914, Royal Navy budgets talk about a new Polyphemus as a torpedo-armed ship. What kind of vessel would this have been? At a glance, I can only find information on the 1881 vessel. Well, putting information together about it is very difficult because it appears that virtually no one in the Navy actually wanted it, and post-war everyone kind of seems to have agreed to memory hold the thing. It was a favourite of Churchill's in the beginning of World War I, though. So how it came about is a little bit disputed. There's 2 potential thoughts, one of which is that when they were initially looking at these fast steam-powered submarine designs, which would eventually become the K-class, someone decided, well, you know what, even if they don't work as submarines, we've still got a low-profile 24-knot, therefore relatively high-speed torpedo craft, which most people kind of went, that's not how submarines work, and that's not how anything works. But nonetheless, there is another theory that someone else just came up with the idea, whole cloth, but either way, possibly aspects of both are true. However, in early 1914, there was a design sketched up, because they were told to, of a 3,400-ton vessel that was 380 feet long with 8 submerged torpedo tubes and a top speed of 28 knots, which basically looked like taking a period light cruiser, so essentially a World War I town-class cruiser, but take off almost everything above the water with just a little conning tower, 2 funnels, not particularly large ones at that, and a couple of masts with a couple of 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and a protective deck, which was almost also the main deck. So not quite a semi-submersible, but a very, very low-profile attack craft. The problem was that, of course, submarines at the time, when they're firing their torpedoes underwater, were moving at slow speeds. So by using submarine-type torpedoes, this thing, although it could go at 28 knots, could only fire its torpedoes when it was moving at under 10, which was obviously not brilliant. So they redid it with torpedo tubes that were a bit more like battleship underwater torpedo tubes, so could be fired at speed. And this revised design was a bit bigger, 420 feet long, now displacing 4,400 tons, and as well as its 8 torpedo tubes underwater, it carried a total of 32 torpedoes, so plenty of reloads. That was basically where it died, because the Royal Navy pointed out that outside of a fleet engagement, it had no role. It had zero peacetime role, and unlike actual submarines, it had no viable reconnaissance role. It didn't have a particularly useful role going after enemy shipping on its own, because, well, they'd see it coming. It really only had one role, and that was to questionably deliver torpedoes in an environment of a full-scale fleet battle where it might be low profile enough not to get shot at. And the rest of the officers looked at it and went, well, we could deliver torpedoes faster and cheaper just with a bunch of destroyers. And destroyers are more useful generally, so why don't we do that? The source of that information, just in case you're interested, along with the extensive footnotes telling you where the original documents can be found, is from the book by Christopher M. Buckey called Genesis of the Grand Fleet, the Admiralty, Germany, and the Home Fleet 1896 to 1914. Picture is just a torpedo cruiser, because obviously there is no real picture of the actual design. HMS Albatross asks, you've mentioned that for capital ship grade guns, the Royal Japanese and US Navies generally tended to view an increase of 1.5 to 2 inches as the point where it gave a meaningful advantage worth the extra weight that the larger guns created in a new class. When does this change as you decrease in gun size? For example, at the cruiser level, is there any major difference between the 7.5-inch guns on a Hawkins class compared to the 8-inch guns on the Counties if you remove the improvements in the turrets and hoists used in the latter ships? So if the Counties had their turrets and hoists adapted for the 7.5-inch gun, would they have been less effective against peer opponents in World War II? And for dreadnought anti-destroyer secondaries, did the 6-inch equipped dreadnoughts in the Iron Dukes and later in the Royal Navy and in the German Navy, when they had similar sized guns, have a tangible advantage over the 5-inch armed dreadnoughts in the US Navy? And did they in turn have an advantage over Royal Navy earlier dreadnoughts, which had 4-inch secondaries? So when a lot of these calibers were being embedded into the navies in the pre-World War I period, well, obviously you used the Royal Navy as a significant example, at the lower end, it was mostly based off of a general rule of thumb that you wanted to roughly double the shell weight to make the gun worthwhile. So, for example, a 6-inch round is, well, it's 2.2 times heavier than a 4.7-inch round, but close enough. Whereas a 7.5-inch round is exactly twice the weight of a 6-inch round, a 9.2-inch round is 1.9 times the weight of a 7.5-inch round, and a 12-inch round is 2.2 times the weight of a 9.2-inch round. Once you start getting into the 13.5 and 15-inch, the ratio drops off a little bit, but it's still relatively appreciable. But if you want to go down and look at gun performance, say the 7.5 versus the 8-inch, there are actually quite a few significant performance differences between the two, and county armed with particularly the 7.5-inch from the Hawkins would be at a significant disadvantage. The county class shell is about 25% or so heavier than the Hawkins class shell, the 7.5-inch shell, but although they both have a very similar muzzle velocity of just under 2,800 feet per second, the fall off in both higher angle of fall and lower striking velocity for the 7.5-inch is quite remarkable. It seems to have a kind of minimum threshold speed of just between 1,050 and 1,100 feet per second. But at 15,000 yards, it's basically just dropped to just that. And at 10,000 yards, it's only doing about 1,200 feet per second. So, and its longest range basically is going to be when you're at 20,000 yards. You can go out a fraction more than that, but even then, at 20,000 yards, it's dropping at basically 45 degrees and about 1,000 feet per second. Whereas with the 8-inch gun, if you look at say 10,000 yards, so relatively close range, it's only dropping in at 7.3 degrees and almost 1,700 feet per second. So it's about a third again faster. And so third again faster plus heavier shell, a lot more kinetic energy, a lot better penetration. At 15,000 yards, when the 7.5-inch shell is down to, as we said, around just over 1,000 FPS, the county class shell is still doing over 1,300 and dropping in at a shallow angle, therefore better armor penetration. And the minimum speed of the 8-inch shell seems to be about 1150 FPS, so it's still going about 100 feet per second faster, even at its lowest possible speed. And at 20,000 yards, it's doing almost 1200 FPS, actually, at about 28 degrees, as opposed to the 45 degrees and 1070 odd FPS. And then on top of that, at the county class cruiser can easily range out to 25,000 yards comfortably, and thanks to its ridiculous elevation, actually almost out to 30,000 yards, although they very rarely would do that. Whereas with the 7.5 inch from the Hawkins, you're out of luck and you're not going any further at 20,000. So a county class armed with Hawkins style guns would actually just flat out be outranged at a number of the engagements that heavy cruisers actually fought in at that point in time. As far as 6-inch secondaries versus 4-inch and 5-inch, the 6-inch did have several quite definitive advantages over the 4-inch. Obviously, it could shoot further. It couldn't shoot quite as fast, but the general rule of thumb that was being applied there was that 1 or 2 6-inch hits to a destroyer of the period would probably stop that destroyer, or at least badly damage it, whereas by the time that the Iron Dukes switched over to 6-inch, there was a genuine concern that you might have to hit a destroyer multiple times with 4-inch guns to get it to stop, and they appreciated that the secondary batteries would be lucky if they got a handful of hits in, so you want those handful of hits to mean as much as possible. In comparison with the 5-inch 51, if you look at the 6-inch guns found on, say, the QEs and the Iron Dukes, there is actually quite a notable difference. So the 6-inch guns have about, roughly speaking, 60 to 70% better armor penetration capabilities. So, for example, at 8,000 yards, a US 5-inch 51 is credited being able to punch through 2 inches of armor. At just 500 yards less, 7,500 yards, the 6-inch gun can punch through 3.5 inches of armor. And if you drop down to just 5,200 yards, the 5-inch 51 is still only going through 3 inches of armor. So the 6-inch has significantly better armor penetration, although obviously against destroyers that may not matter quite as much. Although, interestingly, I think in part because the 5-inch 51s fired with such ridiculously high FPS, partly helped because they're 51 caliber barrels instead of 45 caliber barrels, they actually do have fractionally greater range, if not striking power, than the 6-inch gun. So the 6-inch gun, in its typical casement mount, has a range of around about 15,000 yards at the maximum elevation, whereas at similar elevation, the 5-inch 51 is probably going about 17,000 yards. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harekaze asks, in the film Operation Petticoat, there is a log entry, sighted tanker sank truck. What are some of your favourite logbook entries of a funny and hilarious nature? I think for me they fall into two categories. One is where you get incredibly laconic, sarcastic, or incredibly brief coverage in a logbook of something that's actually incredibly dramatic and important, such as, for example, one logbook for the Battle of Trafalgar, as far as I recall, literally records the entire thing as the weather in the morning, recording that, and then it just goes, fought brisk action with enemy, and made repairs to masts, and piped dinner. And that was an entire battle. It's just fought brisk action with enemy. Yeah, that's all we need to say. You also get things sometimes like man fell overboard, and obviously with the name of the person who fell overboard. And sometimes if they're kind of glad that the person's out their hair, it'll be something like not material lost to service. Or one ship that very nearly was swamped by a storm. The logbook just says, entered storm, water taken on board, pumps were attended to. It's like, you nearly capsized due to intake of water. That's quite a lot to leave out. Perhaps the more traditional type of thing, which is quite amusing, is that there is apparently a tradition in the US Navy, which I found out about a few years ago, whereby the first log entry of the new year is to be rhyming. And I absolutely love that idea, because you can go through all sorts of log entries, and the first one that you'll find, even in the middle of a war, will just be some sailors' attempt at poetry, some of them better than others. So, for example, I shall read you briefly the first log entry for 1942. So this is 1st January 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbour. The USS Idaho's first entry is: resting on the keel blocked in Drydock number 4, in Portsmouth Yard, Virginia, and the nation is at war. Receiving all our services, water, phone, and steam, from the people of the Navy Yard, whose kindness we esteem. Present in the yard with us, they look so very neat, our units large and various of our Atlantic fleet. Commander Battleship Division 5, the SOP afloat, is located in USS New York, a rugged battle boat. And here to do the work, tug, crane, barge, and raft, the unsung workers of the Navy, yard and district craft. With friendly aid we'll fight the war, there is nothing we shall fear, perdition to our Axis foes, and all friends a happy New Year. This tradition, I think, should become universal. Lawson Tse asks, why did the Japanese and the Americans build their fleet for Mahanian decisive battle doctrine despite their massive numerical asymmetry? Surely a form of battle advantageous for the stronger or weaker party would necessarily be determined for detrimental for the other side. Given hindsight, is there an asymmetric naval strategy more suitable for Japan's material condition, and what would that be? Well, it depends when you're looking at, because in the earlier part of the pre-Dreadnought and then Dreadnought period, perhaps up to around 1905, the fleet strength difference between the Japanese and the US navies isn't actually that great. Yes, towards the end of that, the Americans are pulling ahead in number of pre-dreadnoughts, although the Japanese obviously receive an infusion of captured ones from the Russians. But in the 1890s, for example, the number of actual proper ocean-going battleships on both sides is very close to equal. The Americans start to pull ahead, as I said, in the early 1900s. The Japanese lose a few ships in the Russo-Japanese War, but gain a bunch back. But you've got to remember, on top of that, the Japanese are also considering a good number of their armoured cruisers as part of the battle line. They recognise that an armoured cruiser isn't necessarily a one-on-one for a pre-dreadnought, but they plan to have a fair number of them. And the Americans, until they start building the Pennsylvania class in the middle of the 1900s, don't actually have much in the way of armoured cruisers. So if you add up the armoured cruisers as well as the Japanese battleships, again, the Japanese Navy is actually, at least in the Japanese mind, roughly on a parity with the Americans, until, of course, the Dreadnought arms race gets going, and then Japan starts to get rather rapidly left behind. So that's kind of for that period. But when you move forward to the 1930s, the Japanese are also looking at the fact that whereas their fleet can be all one big fleet, and a combined fleet, you might say, the Americans do have to maintain strength on the Atlantic and the Pacific coast. So although the Americans might be numerically superior to them, in theory, as long as the American fleet is split, Japan has local superiority unless and until the Americans can pull a bunch of ships from the Atlantic, which is going to take time, and they may still not be able to pull enough ships to give them a massive advantage, and then they think, okay, well, we can still win that kind of fight. So there are reasons that, as well as obviously the catastrophic misreading of what exactly Bahanian battle doctrine is, but that's neither here nor there. And to be fair to them, the Japanese were planning still a kind of asymmetric naval strategy, because remember, whereas the US was considering destroyers as screens for the battle fleet, and the carriers were there to support the battle fleet, and everything was centered around the battle fleet right up until obviously the very end of the 1930s, the Japanese were considerably more forward-thinking in terms of looking at their main battle line and then going, okay, but the carriers, the cruisers, the destroyers, and even to a certain extent, possibly even the Congos, are really all there to essentially conduct a running attritional fight to wear down the enemy battle fleet, and obviously then reduce their strength such that it either the combined fleet battle line either is roughly on a par or even has an advantage, and then you can follow up with yet more torpedo and air strikes to further weaken the enemy in the middle of battle. So they are already doing a little bit of an asymmetric naval strategy. Now, of course, all of that goes out the window because ground battle fleet engagement is not really how the Pacific War in the 1940s ends up being fought. Now, in terms of properly asymmetric naval strategy the Japanese could have employed in the Second World War, I think there's two that you could look at. One is very much a case of hindsight, but if somebody had had, let's say, future vision or a dream, then they could potentially have pulled this off. And that would be go all in on carriers, simply because the reason they didn't do it at the time is because the evidence for carriers being the truly decisive weapon of war wasn't there for much of the interwar period, so it made sense to still have a battle line. However, if the sort of air purists, who did exist in the Japanese Navy, had been able to push a little bit harder and gotten their wish, then in theory, and I say very much in theory, converting, say, the entire Congo class into a bunch of carriers, and maybe even converting the Fusos and the Iseis into a kind of Kaga-esque, somewhat slower carrier, but carrier still, perhaps again with a bit of hull extension and so forth, and obviously losing a huge amount of weight from getting rid of armour and weaponry. Well, that would give them another 6 carrier hulls already. You probably are never going to persuade them to turn Nagato and Mutsu into carriers, so okay, we'll leave that there. And then instead of the effort that went into building the Yamatos as super battleships, maybe, obviously don't do a Shinano, but do a 60, 70,000 ton super carrier or 2 as well. So that would leave you with a Kiru Butai of a dozen large carriers of varying capabilities and sizes, plus your ancillary stuff like Hyo and Junyo, plus your 2 monster, not Yamato and not Musashi carriers. So at that point you have 14 carriers, ridiculous amounts of aircraft, assuming that you've upgraded your flight schools to be able to, supply that. And then, given how lethal carrier aircraft get at the very end of the 1930s and the beginning of the 1940s, that would be a near impossible scenario for the US Navy to overcome without extremely radical work in the late 1930s. Because, of course, you couldn't do most of this while the treaty period is in practice, but there might just about be enough time to pull it off once Japan drops out of the treaty system. And it would leave everyone a little bit flat-footed. So the US catching up, eventually it would catch up, but so they certainly wouldn't have been caught up by 1941, especially since the majority of the US battle fleet is in no way near suitable enough for carrier conversion the way that something like the Congos might be. The slightly more obvious at the time option might be to invest in a good number of their long-distance submarines, perhaps becoming mine layers or being built as mine layers or being fitted with mines, and immediately going on a massive mine-laying offensive off the Panama Canal, off the west coast, off of Pearl Harbour, and cycle those subs through, because the minute one ship hits a mine, that disrupts the whole area. You have to shut everything down. If you sink multiple ships, great, but actually the shutting down of shipping while everybody tries to sweep mines is more the object. And at that point, it actually serves your purposes to maybe lay mines in small groups in highly trafficked areas, so that they'll hit some mines, panic, everyone shuts down, everyone goes to hunt mines. They'll find 3 or 4 mines, they'll think maybe there are more, they'll spend ages trying to find mines that aren't there, and you then are saving your mines to put in another location where you can just repeat the entire process over and over. It's not a situation that's really going to, unless you get extremely lucky, manifestly dent US fleet numbers, but it is going to massively slow down and paralyze the logistics and redeployment of forces, and that gives you more time to act. Tradesman's Entrance asks, the County-class cruisers were designed with their main battery capable of elevating to 70 degrees for anti-aircraft usage. Do you know if any of the class ever actually used their main battery for this purpose, and if so, did they actually hit anything? I don't believe so, because the major problem that they actually found with the idea wasn't that the guns had problems getting to 70 degrees. They were quite happy sitting there, but the rotation mechanisms for the turret for training and the elevation mechanisms to actually raise the guns just weren't up to the task. So in the middle of the 1920s, when the first counties are being produced and aircraft are pottering around the sky at 80 to 100 knots, this had some utility. By the time the counties are properly in service and aircraft speeds have increased to 200 plus knots, the guns just can't keep up. So there wasn't much point. So they, as far as I'm aware, didn't even bother loading any kind of anti-aircraft 8-inch shells, and the captains didn't bother using them in that manner. Architect096 asks, "Hi Drac, I'm curious about the sailing ships of the ancient Mediterranean. How large and capable were ships, mostly cargo ships, at around the time of the First Punic War? How many people could they transport, and did the ships that traded with the Celts in Britain differ compared to those sailing in the Mediterranean? Any sources you could recommend would be welcome." Well, I guess I could talk about two things. Firstly, yes, there were giant cargo ships at the time. Obviously, they weren't quite as common as they would be sometime later on, but at the same time, even in the 18th and 19th century, when you have big East Indiamen, they don't make up the majority of the world's cargo fleet. A lot of ships are considerably smaller. But very interestingly enough that you specify the First Punic War, because the First Punic War ends in 241 BC, and immediately after, in 240 BC, is supposedly the order that goes out to build the Syracusia, which was supposed to have been the largest transport ship of the ancient world. It's supposed to be absolutely massive. Exactly how massive and exactly how many people she could carry remains a matter of debate, much like the Chinese treasure ships. Some people have said, she's probably about 180 to 200 feet long, which would put her on par with a first-rate ship of the line. However, again, the description of the Syracusia says that she can carry almost 2,000 tons of cargo and almost 2,000 people, plus the crew, plus the soldiers. And even on a first-rate ship of the line, you're going to struggle to get that many people in comfortably. On top of that, you've got the Tessera Conteres, which was ordered to try and outdo the Syracusia, and that thing is supposed to be, according to at least the accounts, if you believe them, it's supposed to be about 420 feet long. So it seems a little unlikely that, given the sheer cost and scale of this thing, that the Ptolemies would have gone for something more than double the length and therefore more than 8 times the volume just to try and outdo the Syracusia. So based on that and various other things like the towers, I think the Syracusia was probably a bit bigger than 180, 200 feet, probably maybe pushing 250, 300 feet. That would certainly then give her a more plausible volume to transport the kind of stuff that she is described as carrying. So theoretically, whatever size you associate with the Syracusia, that is about as big as you can get for the time of the First Punic War. But in more general terms, although it is a fraction later than the First Punic War, there's no reason to suppose that ships of roughly this size didn't exist at the time. There's no real massive technological change that would suddenly enable them. But we know that, for example, Roman or Roman-affiliated grain ships that were occupied in trade could get very large. And how large? Well, we know from some wrecks and some written descriptions that they could actually, ironically enough, given the reference I just made before, get to the size that was almost comparable with first-rate ships of the line, and certainly a good number of them were the size of third-rates. And, I mean, that's a pretty hefty. You're talking 150, 170 feet long, and therefore able to carry, obviously, vast amounts of cargo and a reasonable number of passengers, although passengers tended to be just stuck up on deck. So kind of bring your own tent, pitch up on deck. You're not going down there with the grain. That's the really valuable bit. Now, these ships weren't common. The average cargo ship would maybe move at 20%, if that, of those ships' cargo capacity. But they certainly were around. So, for example, the biblical account of Paul, when he mentions having about 270, 280 people on board, and he specifically says he's actually on a big Roman grain carrier, yeah, that's entirely plausible for one of the bigger Roman ships around, although obviously that's a couple of hundred years after the First Punic War. Now, if you want to look at some sources for this kind of thing, There's the Roman Navy Ships, Men and Warfare 350 BC to AD 475 by Michael Pitasi. Now, of course, that is going to be mostly about warships, but it will also cover transport ships in part. The single best one to pick up, I think, if you can, is to pick up Ships and Seamanship of the Ancient World by Lionel Casson. It's a little bit old, it's about 30 years old now, but it's still an absolutely fantastic book. The only slight issue is even secondhand copies are quite expensive, but the paperback and Kindle versions aren't too badly priced, and it is very, very comprehensive. The other thing that you might want to look at is actually the book that it was designed to replace, which is just called Ancient Ships by Cecil Tor. Now, that's actually a late 19th century book, so obviously there are bits and pieces that aren't included in there based on all the various wrecks and other stuff that have been dug up in the 20th and 21st centuries. But for the publicly available information at the time, it is still a very valuable work. The only thing I would say is, because obviously finding an original 1894 edition is going to be very difficult, be very careful where you get your copy from. It's public domain, and that's kind of the problem. On the one hand, it means there are copies available all over the place. On the other hand, it means an awful lot of those copies are, shall we say, not particularly good. And one of the things it was really, really good for is a ton of really nice illustrations. But it's also relatively cheap. So, for example, you can get a good quality copy from Cambridge University Press if you happen to be in the UK, and it's only 24 quid, as opposed to around 60 for the more recent Casson book if you get it in paperback or Kindle. Paul from Chicago asks, I was recently watching a video on the War of Spanish Succession and was confused for a few moments until I realised that this was the same war as Queen Anne's War, the name I learned it as in American history class. Are there any times you've been mystified as to what an American was on about, or otherwise been talking with an American at cross purposes only to realise you were talking about the same thing? I'm sure it's happened many times where I'm on about something and people don't know what I'm on about. I mean, when I've spoken, obviously, to Ryan Samansky from Battleship New Jersey Memorial and Museum, he's said to me on one or two occasions, he's like, it's usually great talking to you, and then sometimes I have no idea what on earth you're on about, and then suddenly you snap back into coherence, simply because I'm talking in a way that makes perfect sense from a British perspective, and obviously makes zero sense to poor Ryan and his American upbringing. But yeah, there have been times when I've been listening to Americans go on about things and gone, no, that's not right, or what on earth are you on about? Now, fortunately for me specifically, it's been less. That's happened less and less because I've known a few Americans at various points in my life early on. So I got a bit more educated as to American mannerisms in American English. And obviously, I'm rapidly assimilating as time goes on. Plus, of course, there's American cultural importation via TV shows into the UK. So, for example, until I started diving deep into actually how to pronounce things, thanks to Star Trek, which obviously pronounces the officer rank as lieutenant, I was just saying lieutenant to everything, whereas obviously in Royal Navy parlance, it's lieutenant or something close to that, but it's not lieutenant. The difference, I guess, between actually hearing something spoken and something on the page, which you just read. Now, in other terms, one of the things that's greatly perplexed me when it comes to museum ships is where the quarterdeck is. You see, on American ships, I'm still not entirely sure where the quarterdeck is. It seems to be associated either with officers' quarters or where the gangway comes on. Perhaps people could enlighten me in the comments below. But it certainly seems to be somewhere more amidships. And the aft end of the ship is referred to as the fantail. Whereas, as far as I'm aware, on British ships, the quarterdeck is the aft end of the ship. And I think this is just a case of, well, the quarterdeck obviously used to be a raised deck at the aft end of the ship, which is also where the officers were. And over time, it seems that what's happened is that as obviously that raised officer accommodation astern has disappeared, the location, i.e. the highest open deck astern, has stayed as the quarterdeck for the Royal Navy, whereas in America, it seems perhaps that the idea of the quarterdeck being where the officers' quarters are located has been the stronger association. So obviously then as the officers' quarters have moved more amidships, that's become the quarterdeck, leaving them to come up with a new term for the aft end of the ship. I'm also still greatly confused on what the distinction between highway, route, and interstate is, because as far as I can tell, they all seem to be slightly different flavours of what in Britain we would call a motorway. Help. And finally for this week, Lord Nelson asks, how well did the all, or nearly all, carronade-armed ships of the Line and Frigates actually perform for the Royal Navy during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars? Well, broadly speaking, the Royal Navy didn't arm ships of the line entirely or nearly entirely with carronades. Glatton, as an experiment, seems to have been the only one where they tried that for a while, and even with Glatton, after a few years, they went, okay, we'll keep a bunch of them, but the lower gun deck's going back to long guns, because with a big ship of the line, while you did have, yes, a very devastating broadside if you used very heavy carronades, carronades did tend to have maneuverability issues. So compared to a normal cannon, which was much easier to traverse, and also with the big ships of the line, which generally speaking tended to be slightly less agile and slightly less swift, it was far more possible for an opponent, realizing perhaps that you had a bunch of carronades aboard, to just sit outside their range and hit you with long guns until you rolled over and cried. Whereas a handful of frigates and a lot of either sixth rates, which were also small frigates, or unrated ships, especially the unrated ships, were very quickly converted to all carronade armament because, well, 4-pounders, 6-pounders, 9-pounders, and even 12-pounders didn't really cut it by the Napoleonic Wars. But suddenly giving them 24-pounder or 32-pounder carronades or worse gave them fantastically lethal broadsides. The carronades obviously being quite light and easy to work compared to big, heavy long guns on those small ships. And being small, fast, and agile ships, the fact that they had almost no actual range didn't matter quite as much because they could be expected to somewhat dodge enemy fire and use their speed and agility to get right up close. And also being small ships, even if they did have long guns, their accuracy as they pitched and rolled like corks wouldn't have been great anyway. So they'd probably have to get to roughly carronade range to have a chance of hitting anything. So if you're going to do that anyway, you might as well have the heaviest punch you possibly can. And they tended to do generally quite well for themselves. Also because obviously they were quite quick. It meant that if they did run across someone who was able to hold them off with long guns, then unless there was a particularly pressing need to stick around, they could just leave. And that's why, for example, when Sion and Levant took on Constitution towards the end of the War of 1812, or technically after the end of the War of 1812, but who's counting, they were actually a threat to Constitution, despite the fact of being, by number of guns and size, massively inferior to Constitution. The fact they were packed, the gunnels, with carronades, meant that Constitution did actually have to take them seriously and ended up choosing to, via various fancy tactics, fight them one-on-one rather than 2v1, which was probably all for the good, because there is a reasonable chance that if Constitution had just laid into Sion and Levant in a straight-up broadside close-range action, they might very well have been able to at least drive her off, if not overcome her. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everyone, if you've gotten this far. Next week is, of course, Drydock 400, special event.